Planning Commission meeting of the Town of Los Gatos for May 24, 2023. And I welcome those who are in the audience tonight. We appreciate your coming. I'll call the meeting to order and begin with the roll call. Commissioner Raspi.
Here.
Commissioner Hanson.
Here.
Commissioner Thomas.
Here.
Commissioner Burnett.
Yes.
And Commissioner Kyle.
Here.
Commissioner Clark. Did I say Kylie? Okay. Well, we've seen you in the news so much recently in Facebook. Before I start the meeting tonight, I will request that staff please make a presentation on civility and decorum.
The public is welcome to participate in the meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meeting is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. For the benefit of the entire community, the Town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the agenda. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at board, commission, or committee meetings. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at board, commission, or committee meetings. All public comments at the board, commission, or committee meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the chair may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the commissioners exiting the chamber or meeting room. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the commissioners would return to the chamber or meeting room and the chair would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a board, commission, or committee meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code, Section 403.
Thank you for that presentation. And now I'll ask Commissioner Raspi to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you. Please rise. Let's begin. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
So as we commence the meeting tonight, I have a few preliminary remarks. Please take a moment to silence your devices if you haven't already done so. During tonight's meeting, persons desiring to speak must be recognized by the chair. If you wish to address the commission tonight on any item that's during verbal communications or when we consider an agenda item, one agenda item tonight, please raise your hand in the Zoom app, or for those who are here, complete a card, and it looks like we have 2 out of 3, which I appreciate. And please direct your comments to the commission as a body and not to the audience. No person has the right to, has the right to yield their time to another speaker. No member of the public can speak twice on any one item. And to assure the opportunity for all members to speak, the time is limited to 3 minutes. So moving on, as the Planning Commission conducts its meeting this evening, we encourage active participation by the public. which is essential to our democracy and to the important work of the Planning Commission. Public input is very much welcomed, and comments on matters on the agenda items are carefully considered by the Commission members. This participation can occur in several ways. First, written comments about agenda items may be submitted to the staff prior to the meeting, and we have received 2 of those items, which we appreciate. And during the meeting, there are 2 opportunities for members of the public to participate. The first being during verbal communications. Any individual may speak on an item that is not on the agenda for tonight's meeting. And during the hearing on our agenda item, any member of the public may speak about that item. And you'll be advised of those times when they occur. When you're called on to speak, please state your name and address for our record and indicate, or otherwise indicate if you're speaking anonymously. And in fairness to all, okay, we all talked about the 3 minutes already. So we now do come to the verbal communications portion of our meeting, and members of the public are now invited to address the commission on any item that is not on the agenda for tonight's meeting. And staff will announce when your time is up, should you exceed it. And let's see, do we have any members of the public on Zoom, Mr. Paulson?
No one that is raised their hand to speak on an item that is not on the agenda.
Thank you. And any members here wish to speak on an item that is not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none. We'll move on to the consent calendar. And tonight we have 1 item on the consent calendar, which is approval of the minutes of our meeting of April 26, 2023. And before the Planning Commission acts on the consent calendar, any commissioner may request that that item be removed from the calendar. Are there any such requests tonight? Seeing none. I'll now ask if any commissioners have proposed amendments to those meeting minutes. No? And are there any members of the public who wish to comment on the minutes? Not seeing any. So do we have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
Chair, I'll move to approve the consent calendar as presented, please.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Respy. A second? Commissioner Thomas?
I
And we'll have-
second.
And we'll have a raise of hands to show approval or disapproval. Okay, it's unanimous. Thank you. So now we'll move on to agenda item 2, which is a submission by the town in which we are asked to consider a request to forward a recommendation to the town council on modification to the town's height pole and netting policies for additions to and new construction. Staff notes that the proposed amendments to the town policy are not considered a project for purposes of CEQA. And are there any disclosures by commissioners? Seeing none, is there a staff report on agenda item number 2?
Good evening. Good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners. So the item in front of you is consideration of changes to the town's height pole and netting policy, often referred to as the story pole policy. This discussion is a continuation of the item from April 26th Planning Commission meeting. The reason for reconsidering the current story pole policy started with recent requests for exceptions to the current story pole policy, but additional questions and suggestions have been raised in the public comment and at the April meeting. The written staff report that has been provided to you for your discussion tonight provides a series of topics for discussion presented as a series of questions. First, should the town retain a requirement for installation of story poles for development projects? If yes, then what types of projects should be required to install story poles? What types should be excluded or exempt? Should the current requirements be modified? Should specific alternatives be detailed in the story pole policy? Should a modification be made to change the decision maker for the exception requests or certain exception requests? Should the requirement for submittal and approval of a story pole plan be removed from the policy? This concludes staff's presentation, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that presentation. Are there any questions of staff at this time? Commissioner Hanson.
I had a question about ADUs. It doesn't explicitly say that we do or don't require ADUs, but I would assume that we cannot require story poles for ADUs.
Thank you for that question. That's correct, because ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are processed as a non-discretionary process. At this time, it's actually just a building permit for those applications. Story pool policy would not apply to those.
Okay, so when it says additional structures, it would be a non-residential structure on a property, like a pool cabana or something like that, not an ADU.
It could be if there were multiple structures on a property, but for accessory dwelling units, because they are ministerial, they would not be required to do story pools.
Okay, and Chair, if I
Please.
may, one more question. One of the things that was suggested in the staff report as a possibility to consider is if it was the will to continue the story pool policy. One thing that could possibly be an exception was 100% affordable housing. So what would qualify as 100% affordable housing? I'm presuming because people would want to understand that, from the public. So like the North 40 met requirements for affordable housing, but it's not 100% affordable. So 100% affordable is what?
Thank you for that question. So I would say that if that is the recommendation of the Planning Commission, that we could provide some additional information to Town Council about the different levels of affordability and what those thresholds are for them to consider whether there's a specific threshold. But in general, what I would say is that if all of the units in the proposed development are deed restricted to be below market rate, that would qualify as 100% affordable housing.
Other questions for staff? Commissioner Clark.
Thank you. I have two questions. First, I was wondering, what would we do for a proposed 70-foot tall building, for example? I can't imagine that we can do story pools that tall, but...
Thank you. My understanding is that for that type of building, there are some options that could be considered. For example, getting the large cranes that are used in high construction, and those get set up to show to have the string of flags between them. I believe that when we had the Netflix development coming through, that they did something similar to that to show what the height is. You can imagine, though, that depending on how many of those cranes you need to have, it is something that becomes a pretty significant investment, especially depending on how long they need to be in place for.
And may I ask a second question?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. So the other thing I was wondering is, one of the possibilities that was mentioned is only showing things like front facade or, tallest ridge and things like that. And I know it varies drastically, I'm sure, between projects, but in general, would that save like a considerable portion of the cost for a lot of projects?
My understanding is that the extent of the story poles and netting does add significantly to the cost. And so if it were just showing certain portions, that would reduce that impact. We will have some members of the public speaking. I know that we do have a few developers joining us to provide their perspective. And so that type of question based on their experience may add to the commission's discussion.
Great, thank you.
Anything further? Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions for staff. The first is that in our current policy, it states that the story poles enhance understanding of the project for town residents, staff, etc., including us. Can staff make decisions without story poles, I guess is my question, which I have an assumption about an answer, but I still want to know. And then, are there any instances where story poles are necessary for staff to make decisions?
Thank you for that question. I would say that based on the fact that it is not the majority of the agencies in Santa Clara County that actually require story poles, that there's a clear answer of yes, staff can make decisions without story poles.
Okay, and is there any instance that anyone would know about that where they would be really important to the decision-making process on your end?
From staff's perspective, I I don't believe that it would be required for us to be making our recommendations for compliance with the regulations, because there would still be the information in the plans. As stated at the beginning of the story pole policy, it has multi-pronged kind of purpose. And so it is a question of what the intent and goal of the policy is and how best to accomplish that.
Thank you. And may I?
Please?
Thank you. My second question is just that about the story pole plan, and I know we discussed this a little bit last time too, but I just wanted to clarify that is the story pole plan helpful for staff, and what about it if it is, yes or no, like why? And then on average, do you approve the story pole plan, or do you suggest changes before the story poles actually go up?
Thank you for that question. Well, as mentioned at our last meeting, we find that it is helpful to have the story pole plan in advance so that staff has the opportunity to make sure that the critical elements of the building are represented. And there's the concern that if there wasn't a story pole plan, but staff was still expected to go out and take a look and make sure that it really was fully represented, that there might need to be modifications in the field to what was installed. So that's part of the question behind it. And I think we do often say, indicate that, no, you need to have more poles or different poles or something's inconsistent. I'm not sure how often there would actually need to be changes in the field, because based on my experience, the story pole installer will represent the building reasonably well. Sometimes the corrections to the story pole plan actually just have to do with how it was drawn rather than how it would all actually be installed. One of the additional benefits to having a story pole plan that we have found is that it sometimes is helpful to members of the public to understand how those poles and netting represent the building that is drawn in the plans.
Commissioner Burnett.
Thank you, Chair. Question. So since this policy, the story pole policy, has been in effect since 1998, I'm wondering why now are there changes that want to be made to it, since is it because of the new pending larger projects, or I know the builders have always known of the cost. This is usually a built-in cost, and they've been aware of this. So I'm wondering, is there something that has triggered the want for the desire to change our policy?
Thank you for that question. Yes, as stated in the staff report, the reason for bringing this forward was based on direction from town council, because we have had several taller projects come through that required a request for an exception, which added multiple months to the process for those, and added to the work of the town council, and indicated that once buildings go more than 35 or 40 feet, that this may be a recurring issue. They did ask staff to bring to Planning Commission this discussion for what modifications may be needed. In addition to that, you have heard and seen in written comments a number of other concerns from the public and suggestions for modifications and alternatives. And so those have also been incorporated into the items proposed for consideration tonight. As part of this discussion. In addition, there also, as was previously mentioned, is a discussion for production of housing and whether this is considered a governmental constraint. It is something that is currently in the draft housing element for consideration, that we would look at the story pole plan policy to consider whether modifications should be made, though no determination has been made whether it needs to be changed.
Does that answer the question? Okay, any further questions of staff at this time?
Thank you.
If not, we'll open the public portion of the public meeting on item 2 and invite comments from members of the public. And we'll start with anyone who may be participating on Zoom. Mr. Paulson, do we have any?
Thank you, Chair. So for the participants on Zoom, if you are wishing to speak on the story pole policy, please raise your hand. There we go. Took a little while. First speaker will be Jesse.
Good evening. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but my name's Jesse Bristow with Swenson Builders, and I'm listening in through YouTube because there's no audio on the Zoom, but I hope you can hear me, and it looks like everyone can. So I'll just speak to our project, which is on Shelburne and Winchester, and as earlier discussed, there was the project that we're proposing. The building height is around 38 feet, and then we have a mansard roof, which is designed to hide the equipment and solar equipment, heating, and all those things, and reflect the architecture that was requested per our CAC meeting. And so essentially what happened is we used string flags to accommodate that size, because once you go that height, you cannot do netting. And so we had to ask for a variance, and they actually had to ask for a variance twice because of trying to implement that new design that council recommended for us, and additionally, all the storms that we had. So now we have a variance to create a 3D walkthrough video of the project, which we actually feel articulates the architecture and the finished product much better. But I would agree with the discussion that it could be a constraint for future housing. It is exceptionally costly. The vendor that we use is one of, I want to say, two in the Bay Area. And our initial install was about $70,000. And on top of that, we pay about $7,000 a month on rent for those flags that essentially aren't doing anything for our project. And we've had those flags installed since November. So it's painfully expensive, and it does prevent us from trying to move our project forward to the Planning Commission. And again, one of our discussions that we had at our most recent city council meeting was that do the flags really even highlight what's going to be there? There were some neighbors, there were some council members saying we just see some orange flags in the sky. We don't know what that means. And so I feel that it can be prohibitive. And so I think there are alternative solutions, such as renderings, such as videos. We have a lot of technology today that we can use. And so that's just kind of our experience in a nutshell. I apologize, I only have 3 minutes. So, but we do encourage a change to the policy. So especially with future arena housing goals, and density bonuses that allow you to break the height. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Jesse. And before you go, we will ask any of the commissioners if they have questions for you. I'm not seeing any. Thank you very much. Oh, I guess I would like you to further explain the video process. Like, were there particular protections to make sure that it was accurate?
Jesse, are you still there?
He may have hung up.
Did KCAT look into?
So KCAT did check, and they've got the audio coming through. So they're not sure whether it's something on his end.
Well, Jesse, we give you another opportunity to participate after we're done with the other public comments. And I'd like to see if you have questions or responses to that kind of question, or if any other commissioners at that time wish to ask questions of you. Do we have anyone else on Zoom, Mr. Paulson?
Thank you, Chair. If anyone else that is on Zoom would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand. I'm not seeing any hands yet, Chair, but maybe we'll go to the folks in the room and then recheck.
Agreed. So why don't we start with Mr. Fagot? Thank you for coming and speaking. And right into the mic if you would.
Good evening, and thank you all for the work that you're doing on behalf of our community. Appreciate it. I'm speaking as an individual in our town, a long-term resident. I'm not representing any groups. I think that we need to be considerate of the long-term impact of new construction that goes on in town, regardless of whether it's residential, commercial, whatever. It's there for a long time, and it's in a variety of different types of neighborhoods, historic and as well as general commercial and so forth. And so it is not just in that particular neighborhood where the construction is occurring, but it is impactful townwide. And therefore, all members of the community, all members of the town should be able to see what this new construction is going to look like. I like the idea of the virtual, but not alone. That with the story polls, and I'm advocating for the story polls, helps give a better image of what the impact is going to be from different perspectives as you look at the site, particularly with the hillsides in our various topographies. I believe that there's an opportunity to perhaps have less dense netting, so it's not going to be impacted by strong winds, as we saw back in December and January. So that type of amendment, I think, would be very helpful for the contractors. And story poles without netting makes no sense. I think also the suggestion that was made to put flags at the top, where you see where the peak of a roof would be, would help to give a perspective. So the flags with less dense netting would be good with these story poles. Also markings on the story poles like every 10 feet, so you get a sense of how high this construction is going to be. Those markings should start at the new grade, not just where the site is currently. So that's my proposal. Please consider that as you make a decision to make your recommendation to the council. Story poles have been working for a long time. Yes, there is a cost associated with it, but the benefit is the community, the large community, gets to see what the impact is going to be on that site. And that's very helpful for this town to have its sense of community and well-being. So thank you for your time and your work for us.
Thank you, and I'll ask if any commissioners have questions for you. Commissioner Thomas?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Figo, for coming tonight. My question for you is, you mainly mentioned new construction. So our story pole policy accounts for remodels and things like that. So I was just wondering what your feelings were about those.
So when I say new construction, I mean on perhaps an existing site that has already been developed. So not just blank tarmac. Yeah.
Okay. So additions and new builds. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Looks like not. Thank you again. And we'll now call on Mr. Cross.
Hi, thank you. My name is Noel Cross. I'm a practicing architect for over 35 years, and most of that has been in the town of Los Gatos. Got maybe dozens of projects before the commission. I hope you read our letter. It was mostly written by Beth Wiersma, and but there's 6 or 8 of us architects that regularly go before this commission and work with the town, and we had a lot of input into that. And we thank you for letting us talk about something that we deal with every day very intimately, and we know all the ins and outs of it. I'd like to underline just a few points in the letter. Basically, they're really more hurtful than helpful. They really don't represent the character of the building at all. They represent only the worst parts of it, the mass, the height, and the bulk of the structure. And but they don't communicate any nuance, any materials, color, shade, shadow, roof line, proportion, all things that architects care passionately about, and we work on, and we work on them in our renderings, in our 3D thing that we We think about that all the time, and those things go up, and it conveys none of that. I have learned over 35 years of doing this is that our neighbors of our projects are very fearful, mostly about the unknown. And because these story poles convey none of the nuance and the beauty and how the sun reflects off of a roof or a wall, or how a certain overhang shades the building. None of that gets conveyed with these story poles, and so it only stokes the fear, and it makes it worse. And our renderings are way better at communicating actually what's going on, because sometimes there's areas where the hill is graded away. There's a fence. There's some trees. There's landscaping. All of which is in our renderings. None of which is conveyed by these story poles. It's an analogy. It's like trying to convey one of Mozart's most beautiful symphonies by just showing you the sheet music. You don't get it at all. You don't get you really understand any of it. And also the ironic part is the color of the netting is orange. Somebody did the research. It's a LRV of 44. The hillside design guidelines require nothing more than a 30. Why are we having something orange and fluorescent when that's not really what's going to be up there? Most roofs are dark, earth tone, black, brown, gray. And the orange is not a color that's in any project I've ever designed, that's for sure. So
unfortunately, your time is up, but you'll have a further opportunity to speak if there are questions from the commissioners. Thank you. Commissioner Respi.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you, Mr. Cross, for your comments. You indicated that you are an architect practicing here in Los Gatos. I imagine you've practiced in other jurisdictions as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Can you explain to us your experience in other jurisdictions that don't use story poles? How do you convey the massing, the idea of the building in those jurisdictions?
They rely on our renderings.
How do you convey those to the public?
Well, we have to turn in renderings, if we do it because it's a smart thing. Showing floor plans and elevations, most people can't understand that. And so renderings are really, the computer renderings are, and they're extremely accurate because they have to be, because we're designing the entire building. We're representing it. They also become our elevations, which get measured by staff, and so it's really something that is, you really get the sense of what the building looks like, as opposed to just the poles and the orange netting. And all you get is the worst part, which is the size of it. And to make it worse, especially if there's an existing building that you're either tearing down or adding to, it's so confusing for people. I did one project in Saratoga where 80% of the new building was not in the same footprint as the old building. So it would have been twice as big. It would have appeared twice as big because people cannot subtract the building that's going to be torn down. And so we were given the option of not doing them, and we took that.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that answer.
Yeah.
Other questions for Mr. Cross? I have a question. Jesse, who spoke first, talked about a video presentation. Is that something that the architectural community is beginning to look at?
Yeah, in the last couple of years, our software that we use is ArchiCAD, and there's a new app with the last maybe 3 iterations of the software, and it's called Twinmotion. And you basically input the thing, and then you can create a movie. So you can drive down the sidewalk, you can go around the backyard, you can fly, and you can create a movie. And then show context, obviously, too. We often will show the neighboring buildings in a very simple way, basically just relatively boxy, sort of, so that you can see the relationship of the sizes of the buildings.
Right, so they would show the size and height of the neighborhood buildings?
Yeah.
Neighborhood residences?
Yeah. But we have to do that already with streetscape elevations, especially if it's in a neighborhood where the buildings are close together.
Right.
Not so relevant with a hillside project, but.
Those are my questions. Thank you for your responses. Commissioner Thomas.
I just have a follow-up to that question. Thank you for coming tonight and speaking and answering our questions. I guess that my question is just related to how easy, once that video is made, is it to change things? For example, if those videos of like in the renderings were made available to the public and public notice went out like earlier than what we've been typically what we see with the story polls. You know, story polls go up and then it's kind of towards the end of the process. How easy is it to tweak things if something came out about, like, you know, people having an issue with the color or something, and that was a compromise that was needed to be made during the planning process?
Well, I'm not sure the video changes anything because we're going to do renderings anyway, and it's to our advantage, and it's a requirement for the planning to do. You know, you just take stills from different angles, and if changes are going to be made, but with color, height, roof, things like that, we're going to make them in the model. When you create a video, and then you can just, you don't have to recreate it in a sense. You just change the building and then hit play again, and it's the same video.
Okay, so it would be similar to like if you were changing the renderings, you just click a few things and save the changes and it's updated.
Well, you make it sound so simple.
I know. But yes, I mean, it's a similar process.
No, yeah, it's not, the
Not
video
starting
doesn't
from
change
scratch.
anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Further questions? I came up with another one. Can you speak to the issue of the cost of doing actual modeling?
Well, we're doing it anyway.
You are.
We're doing 3D stuff anyway.
Yeah, but I'm talking about
Because it's part of the
physical
construction
modeling.
documents process, it's part of the entire process of designing the building. We're doing the 3D model, virtual 3D model. And so there's no added cost.
I'm speaking to a physical model.
Oh, physical model,
Yeah.
that's okay, that's a whole different thing, yeah.
Right.
We used to do those, but they are very costly.
Mm-hmm.
They're quite costly. They are cool, though. I would have to say that even in video or renderings, things like that, they take and even if you were just to do a walk around on screen, it's still harder for the human eye and brain to figure that stuff out. When you see a physical model, takes 1 second and you get it. I did a presentation to the San Jose City Council, and we were doing a very large 105 unit thing, and it was relatively modern, and so we had floor plans and elevations, and it was relatively featureless, and we got a lot of sort of nonverbal communication from the members of the commission who were like, boy, this is not going well. And then the people that were bringing the model in, who were late, it's a big model, it probably, filled half of this table. And they brought it in and set it down, and it was a couple of blocks, city blocks. All of a sudden, everybody's smiling, and so many people just said, I was going to vote no, but now it's an absolute solid yes because of that physical model. So they are really effective.
Can you give us any idea of a cost factor that's involved in that? I know it's going to depend on the
Probably wouldn't be
magnitude of
as
the
much
project.
as, I don't know, it's kind of hard to say. We haven't done it in a while, but they are time consuming. And if you really wanted to do it professionally, you get somebody to do it. We've done 3D models. I've done them, with the, what do you call it, the machine that makes the stuff, the 3D stuff. 3D printers. Yeah, 3D printer. We've done that.
I see.
It's kind of expensive, but I would wager to say on a typical residential project, probably not as much as story polls. Story poles are in the 15 grand, 20 grand range.
Thank you. That's very helpful. No other questions? Okay, thank you again. And next we have Ms. Worsom.
Hi, good evening, Commissioners. Beth Worsema, Studio 3. Also a local architect, been working in the city of town of Los Gatos for not as long as Noel. Probably don't make as pretty models as Noel, but I just wanted to reiterate, please take a look at the points that we made in the letter that we gave you last time. That were some specific suggestions that we felt could be built into modifying the story pole policy in terms of creating certain buckets. You know, maybe there are projects that don't need story poles. Maybe if something is highly contested or a larger project or is asking for an exception or a variance, maybe those are the projects that are story poled. But you know, if neighbors are fine with looking at 3D models and renderings in 3D, I think when we all refer to 3D models today, we're really talking computer renderings over actual physical models. And I think those are more helpful anyway. I would like to say that, you know, we know staff has put a lot of work into this issue, but unfortunately the owners, developers, and design professionals have really not had a chance to be able to timely produce our recommendations. We're trying to get better at following staff communication and deadlines, but they have been challenging to keep up with, and direct notices and requests for comments come too late, as in last Friday, for us to remember to give you additional feedback. We apologize for that. We know that this is a very important issue, and we feel very strongly that it's actually directly related to the permit streamlining process, which is something that Town Council has directed staff to work with local design professionals on. We would like to suggest having a study session for our group of design professionals, owners, developers, story pole contractors, and town staff, and to use tonight's staff report as a basis for a more thorough and meaningful discussion, and to be able to come back to Planning Commission with a collaborative recommendation that probably has more specifics in it that actually address things like buckets of when something or at what level something and how something should be story poled. I think there are two issues here. One is story poles, as you've heard every design professional say, do not accurately represent a project, period, end of report. There is no workaround for that. Secondly, it's the process in which the town deals with the story poles. And that's where the permit process gets hung up and where we would like to see additional streamlining, because that's far different than even other local jurisdictions that have story poles. I think, you know, it would be nice if staff and ordinances that were made would rely on the professionals like civil engineers who have to certify that ridge heights are there. Story pole setters that have to put the poles up know how to put them up better than what we might draw, better than what might get edited for what wants to see them being drawn. We're not building a house out of pickup sticks.
So we're at 3 minutes.
Okay.
Why don't we let commissioners ask you questions, and maybe you can get into some of the other areas you wanted to. Other questions? Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm a little confused. Are you requesting no story poles for any and all new buildings or additions, or I'm not quite
So
sure.
I think
I'm sure the town could streamline your permit process and do other things to help with what you've requested in the past, but what do you really want from us?
So I want to be clear, the letter, even though it came from my email, I'm the one who somehow got to wear the crown of putting the we in this is not me. I am part of it, but it is actually a collaborative group of 6 or 8 architects, a developer, that get together and kind of talk about, you know, how we can help things be better in the process, or how we're each managing different things, right? In the original letter that we submitted after we knew that this was kind of on the docket, we did have some suggestions that we didn't believe certain things don't need to be story poled. We suggest that no single-story new home needs to be story pulled regardless of location unless it is asking for an exception or a variance. No single-story addition should need to be story pulled. No story pulls should be required if there are added roof elements to a single or two-story home that sit within the overall massing and below the highest existing ridge line, such as dormers or an additional shed roof portion or things of this nature. I think we also had a conversation as a group about, hey, neighbors and owners really want renderings. They want to see what this is actually going to look like. They're more responsive to that. They have more educated questions about it. It's not a fear-based conversation. And so if there is no contest from the immediate neighbors, which I think is who we are deemed to really making sure that the overall massing is fitting in on, and we do a lot of drawings, not just story polls, plans to show how that works, and that's reviewed by Larry Cannon, by the planners. We get feedback on it. I think if it's an uncontested project and we don't have an issue, then why are we going through this extra step? So if the immediate neighbors, who are supposed to be the most impacted, are okay with it, do we really need to story pull the project? I don't know. I guess, did that answer your question?
Mostly.
Okay.
I
Can
do
I
have-
help you? Can I finish it? Okay.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure, please proceed.
The follow-up question would be, so people that in town that are driving by and there's going to be a project and they're, working and not aware of what's going on, but the policy now has changed and there's going to be no story polls, but you have to access it by video or what your suggestions are to see what the new project will be like. And then all of a sudden, now this large building goes up. So are there other ways to sort of let the public know rather than video? Because I don't see people accessing a video that are busy with work. If you had flyers, if you put it in the newspaper, if you document it, if it's going to be a large project, and I'm just saying
Sure.
this might be an option.
Sure.
To help alert the neighbor or the community of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think there should be
I
something
think
in addition.
I agree with that. I mean, we all have and let me back up and say that the majority of the comments that we gave and what I can speak to as a professional has really to do with single-family homes from an architectural perspective. My feedback really is not about a big 100-unit development or something like that. So when I'm answering this, that's on our behalf when we speak as a group of residential architects. I know the group does bigger projects, but in general, our comments are based on, individual single-family homes. I think, notification happens in a couple different ways. We are asked, if not required, to be sure that immediate neighbors are notified. Those are the ones that are most impacted. There is a sign that goes up with a story poll when we story poll a project. So why not continue the sign? Why not have more than one rendering, have a couple views of that? On those signs, it's required that we put the application number, the request, what's going on, some critical information. So there's a lot of information, and people can then go on to the town's site and look at plans. They can also come down and now meet at the counter and have a planner walk them through questions. And this does happen. I mean, we do sometimes get feedback from some completely random person that isn't even in the neighborhood that has decided to take an interest in a project. And then on most of these projects, they will also have a tech review or another form of a hearing where neighbors can come and speak and ask questions and kind of talk about it. So there's multiple steps along the way besides story polls where people do get noticed.
Thank you.
Further questions? Commissioner Clark?
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick question. How do you generally notify the immediate neighbors?
So what I recommend to my clients, and I think we could ask everyone here, we ask our client, who obviously has these people as their neighbors, to please reach out at the appropriate time. We ask our clients to host a little social, whether that's a happy hour or coffee hour or whatever, and I normally come so that I can answer any questions. We have a set of plans there. We'll have views, and normally we will have like the 3D rendering views that aren't required with story poles per se, except for the one for the sign. And we, share those. We talk about them. We keep a list of which neighbors and what address came. If it's a project that's noticed to a larger group because it's a larger project, then that notification goes out from the town, and we make sure that we also say, hey, this is when we're doing this, and we let people know. Some of my clients will prefer not to do something in person, so they do a kind of an email blast, and then we just collect information and we let the planners know what we did for changes or no changes. It's kind of a mix. The thing I think is interesting is that people do respond to renderings much better, in person, et cetera. And I think we'd love the opportunity to share with you. I think we could all bring project examples where we show you what some story poles look like. We show you what a rendering that's keyed to that, like an actual rendering looks like. And then we can even show you final products. And I'm going to bet that all of you are going to hate the story poles. The rendering's going to be exciting on some level, and the final product is actually going to be the best. So I think you should understand the documents that go into the process. I think you should know and see what those all are. We do get edits from staff that add to, the time of when of the permit process, et cetera. So I think there's a couple issues going on here, not just the story poles themselves and how neighbors are noticed, but also the process.
Other questions? Look like you're free finally to go. Thank you so much for coming and providing your opinions.
Thank you.
Do we have anyone back on Zoom?
We do. I'm not certain that we actually have the problem solved, but we're going to give it a shot.
And chair, through the chair, I have actually communicated with the two people who are on Zoom. They are both interested in speaking and understand. They've been listening to it through YouTube. So they have been able to listen to the discussion, but they may be delayed in answering questions. So what I'd like to recommend is that if you want to restate the question that you had for the first online speaker, Jesse, that we might go to Mr. Capabres for him to give his comments, and that gives the first speaker time to hear your questions, so that then we can come to him at the end, if that works for the chair. It's
Yeah.
a little confusing and tangled, I know, but.
That's fine. Why don't we proceed in order, beginning with Jesse if he's back? And then we can certainly interrupt our larger discussion to receive other comments from the public.
So for Jesse, who we already heard from, he is available. He's already used the 3 minutes,
Right.
but he is available to answer your question. So if you still have a question to ask of him, you could ask that now.
Okay, thank you for that. My question to Jesse was, how do you perceive a way to ensure the
Steve Bristow again. I apologize. There's probably about a 30-second lag in from what I hear on YouTube. I apologize. So I would just like to try to answer as far as the original question from the chair was, hey, can you adjust the CAD, or I'm sorry, how precise is the model? And the previous speaker, Noel, he spoke greatly about that. It's exact. So it is a CAD model, and it is to those exact measurements. So the video you are seeing is to true scale. And I know there's discussion about the cost, and I think that was more related to single-family homes. So I just wanted to express that the cost is kind of reflective of the size, and we do have a relatively large building, so that's why our cost is more. And another note that I took was, how do people, passerbys, have access to these potential renderings or 3D video? We were directed by town council to put in a QR code on our signage with renderings. We have 4 parcels, so we were directed to have a sign on each parcel with the rendering, with a disclaimer saying, hey, these flags do not represent the true model. Please look at this QR code. And then the QR code will take someone to the video and our 3D video, which the previous architect spoke that, hey, you can look at these with plantings, with shadows at different times of day. I would say we're about 90% done with the video that we are working on after we were directed by town council or allowed by town council to have a 3D walkthrough model. And we're really excited about it. And so we're hopeful that you guys will be able to see that soon. And maybe that's something that can help with your decision-making in the future. And I do apologize if I'm not able to answer anything further, but I will listen to the playback. Thanks.
Well, if I could just ask for one clarification, and that is, in the video, is there a key to existing landmarks, corners of adjacent homes, for example, or other visual points of reference that could be used to assure the accuracy in terms of the viewpoints, for example?
So as Ms. Armour mentioned, it's probably going to be about 30 seconds before he hears this, so we'll just have to sit and wait.
Hello, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I'm trying to keep up. To answer the question, the whole intent of the 3D model is to show the true relationship of the neighbors. More specifically, I believe it's University Townhomes or University Oaks, which are the townhomes right next door. And so really wanted to show the relationship of the concerned neighbors and the adjacent building that's at 2 stories with their related frontage. And then we actually use drone footage to do a flyover to show the relationship of the finished product to the rest of the town and the neighbors. And so yes, it's to further highlight that relationship more so than what you would see in a 2D rendering. So, and I apologize if I'm speaking out of turn.
No, that's a very good response to my question. I appreciate that. And I don't think there's other questions from commissioners at this time, so thank you for your participation. Okay, if we have no other speakers on Zoom.
Chair, there is one more speaker.
Oh, excuse me?
Yeah, Don.
Hello, Chair Barnett. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Maybe
Please
give me a thumbs
proceed.
up, because I'm trying to listen on YouTube. I'm going to talk anyway. My name is Don Capobres. Good evening, Chair Barnett, Commissioner, staff. I'm going to just kind of jump to the chase. I know we've submitted some letters on our viewpoint on the story polls, but in the spirit of trying to be collaborative and give you some of our experience on the North 40 and maybe some suggestions on other methods. I'm going to skip all the kind of negativity of my prepared comments. Last hearing, there was general consensus that story polls are largely effective in alerting the general public about potential land uses, and I believe that. But there's got to be a better way to do this. I want to highlight some of the biggest kind of concerns that we had kind of during the North 40 story poll program. I mean, first of all, they should have been done when there was a chance for the public to make an impact on the land use policy decisions. And I'm not really sure how to implement this, but for example, it should have been done at the beginning of the specific plan process, not when an application was being submitted that complied with the specific plan. In the case of phase 2 of the North 40, we're in the housing element. We now have an SB 330 pre-application in. It's kind of too late for the general public to really make significant changes to that, given state law protections. Second, the interior story poles at the North 40, we put up over 600 story poles at a cost of nearly $1 million. And those interior poles, the general public could not see them. And the only way to see them was to access a private property through an invitation. We're not required to have council members or planning commissioners walk the interior of the site. And so the general public really didn't have a chance to see the interior story poles. And then the third biggest issue was that we were required to keep the 600 plus story poles up standing for over half a year as the various planning commission and town council hearings got extended, and that put a lot of cost into it. Danger, I think, from impacts on weather. We had to provide free rent to businesses out there, enterprise rent-a-car, some office tenants, impacted residents. I think the length of time that the story poles were up was just not really helpful to anybody. Again, if the main benefit is to alert the public, I think people knew within the first couple of weeks that there was something happening on the North 40. I think there are other things. Technology's made great advancements. Other speakers have kind of commented on that. I would say, we do have an 80-foot tall building proposed on phase 2. Renting cranes to do story poles for that is just, we had to rent the boom lifts in phase 1, and to rent 4 of those cost us $20,000.
Mr. Kabobras, I'm sorry,
times 6 months, $120,000 just on that.
Your 3 minutes has expired.
So we would advocate for looking at tethered balloons, the photo simulation, computer renderings. QR code-based technology, as the other speaker has talked about, is advanced very well, and we would be excited to be able to try something like that out. And we did build the physical model of the entire phase 1 of the North 40 that was housed at the library for some time, and 3D printing has really helped the cost efficiency of that. It looks like my time.
Okay, good. Are there questions for Mr. Kabobras from members of the commission? I do not see any. So we'll move on to another speaker from Zoom.
There are no more speakers on Zoom, Chair.
Okay, very well. So now we'll close the public portion of the public hearing on item 2 and proceed. I would propose we proceed through the staff report on the suggested outline from staff, considering issues related to the story poles. They're designated items A through F on pages 14 to 17 of the staff report. And item G sets forth opinions from our town attorney, and we can consider that after covering the previous sections. On each item, we'll see if we have a consensus that would support a motion. If not, I understand that staff will bring to the council the ideas that we've discussed on that item. Okay, so we talked about the fact that there's no appeal rights on this, or did we talk about appeal rights? There will be no appeal rights since this is only a recommendation to council, and we discussed the fact that no findings will be required. So why don't we move on to the staff report. Item A on page 14. And this raises the basic question of whether story poles should be required by the town or not. And we've been informed that a majority of the jurisdictions in the county do not have that requirement. And the issue is open for discussion by the council, by the commission, as to whether we want to follow the majority, or for reasons particular to Los Gatos, we would like to keep them. So we'll start with Commissioner Hanson.
I sit on the Housing Element Advisory Board, and it was brought up by the HCD letter that, potentially story poles can be an impediment to production of affordable. I don't think the town's ready to, the people in our town would be ready to not have story poles at all. I think instead what might make sense is to look at the totality of the story pole policy and see if there can be some things that could be taken out of having to have story poles. And we can talk about that. Those are some of the items that you have that are in the staff report. But for me personally, we've had story poles for quite some time, and even with all due respect on the North 40, even after having a committee that met for several years on the North 40 specific plan, it wasn't until those story poles went up that people really started to understand what it meant to the town. And it's been a hot topic of discussion on all the threads like Nextdoor and stuff since then. And so I think it would be a big step for the town to think about going from what we have now to nothing. And I would prefer something, from my point of view, in between with the reduction and some streamlining.
Thank you for that comment. Commissioner Clark.
I just have a quick question for staff. For the majority of cities in our county that don't require story poles, does that mean that story poles never go up in their cities?
That is my understanding, that they generally do have signage that goes up with certain types of projects, but that story poles are not part of the process.
Okay, thank you.
Other comments? Commissioner Raspy?
Thanks, Chair. Excuse me. First of all, I want to thank the public comments tonight via writing on Zoom, as difficult as that was, to help us inform our decisions. I think this really is a technical discussion in a lot of respects, and I think it's really helpful to the commission to have an informed and educated discussion. And I think it's evident from what we're hearing that story poles are, at best, a blunt instrument. There are certainly more effective ways, I think, that are coming into fashion now that we can use for our projects. That being said, I don't think they're without some purpose. I think they have a purpose of educating and alerting our public that projects are coming online, and I think they're useful in certain projects, although I think we probably in this town overuse them for every project. So my sense is, much like my fellow commissioner, there's a time and a place for them, and I'd like to have a discussion about maybe winnowing that down to the more essential time and place and letting more projects go through on a more streamlined and economic basis. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Other comments are most welcome. Commissioner Thomas?
Well, I agree with what my fellow commissioners have said tonight, and I think that do you want to, are we going to make a motion that we should just say?
We're ultimately looking for motion. We can
Okay.
discuss that in the course of that meeting.
Okay, does anyone, if I make a motion or what? Okay. So then I move to what are we doing? Moving to recommend that we retain a requirement for installation of story poles for development projects.
With further details.
With further
coming
details
out of-
coming in the other sections with all of the things.
Yes, I believe that
All the
that
stuff,
should
you know.
that should work. The general initial.
The general, yeah, we think we should still have requirements, but not as many as we have right now. So we will discuss those.
Thanks for the motion. A second?
Perfect.
Commissioner Burnett, I think, was first.
I second that motion.
Thank you. Discussion? I just had a comment, which is, I think there's some uniqueness to our town that may not be shared by some of the other jurisdictions in the county. We've got the hillsides, we've got historic areas, we've got established neighborhoods that have their own distinct characters. And while I believe in certainly paring down the requirements to when they're most essential, I do think that we should keep them also. So can we have a show of hands in support of the motion? It's unanimous. Thank you very much. So now let's move on to item B, concerning what types of projects should be required to install story poles and what types should be excluded or exempt. And you've got the agenda and staff report before you, so I don't know that I need to read the whole thing. And I'll ask you to give some thought to that. I'm sure you already have, and to begin a discussion. Commissioner Thomas.
I'm happy to go first since I submitted some public comments to be shared with the commission. Sorry, I'm just going to adjust this. So I, just based on all of the comments that we've gotten from all of the public and architects, developers, etc., I do think that I agree that we are a unique jurisdiction compared to some of these other towns and cities near us. And so I thought that a good compromise would be, we have different requirements for hillsides. And so I thought that I kind of looked at what the city of Los Altos is doing, or the town of Los Altos versus the town of Los Altos Hills, and kind of thought that if we did a mix of that, that would really meet our requirements here in town. So I thought that we should have, similar to like the different categories that the architects that spoke tonight and submitted requests or public comment a month ago, I guess you could say, had, that we should have for in hillsides, any new buildings, second story additions exceeding 900 square feet, accessory structures exceeding 900 square feet, and then it says T's proposed, but it's supposed to say trees. Trees proposed to be removed. I do have a couple of questions for staff. I did notice in our policy and in the other policies that were provided that this tree tagging is lumped into these story pole policies, but it's kind of a separate issue. I was like, oh, I see why it is lumped in, but at the same time, I don't know if we already have, if we already have some sort of policy like our tree ordinance. Does our tree ordinance cover this anyway?
Thank you for that question. I can provide clarification. At this time, we require that when there are trees being removed as part of a project, that there be an arborist report, and that would number and tag the trees with a little number on them. And so then the arborist report then shows which of those numbered trees would be removed. And so I think what's being suggested in some of the comments is that some sort of colored tape would be put around the trees. I would say that in many cases, those are going to be interior to the project site. And so putting that kind of tape on them would not actually be visible from the public right-of-way to the public. But I would say that generally that is a separate category from story poles. But clearly has been part of the discussion and the comments received.
Okay, thank you. So then I feel like that the trees should be removed because I feel like it just complicates things. So I would no longer recommend that we include that here. And the main changes for this part was that it looked like the city or Los Altos Hills had a 900 square foot. That was like their marker. Above 900 square feet or larger was what triggered this. Ours is smaller now. I think it was like 1 or 400. 100 or I wrote it. I had it somewhere. It's 100, which I feel like is a little bit excessive. So, I mean, I'm happy. I just kind of put down the 900 square feet. I'd be happy to hear what other commissioners think about that number. But I do think that something different for Hillside, that would be important. And then also, I do think that projects in historic districts asking for exceptions or variances, I do think that is something that from all of the public comments that I've ever heard in all of the hearings that we've ever done, I know our historic districts are really important to us in town. And so I think that asking, if anyone is asking for exceptions or variances, unless the lot is non-conforming, because we do have some odd-sized or non-conforming lots in those areas too. So I don't know if that triggers to the community development director with regards to the exceptions process. So those were kind of my thoughts, and then also requiring them maybe for specific plans, similar to the North Fort, even though I understand that was not really, that didn't end up being productive, but some sort of requirement for that.
Thank you. That gets us well on our way in the discussion. I recognize that Section B is the longest in the staff report, and that there's subsections here. So I want to encourage comments in general, but maybe we should move on. Let's see, in the first paragraph, there's a general suggestion of discussion of the types of projects, and that's sort of continued in the use types. But I was wondering if other commissioners had comments that are specifically related to the type of projects that should be included or excluded, and then we can move on. Commissioner Clark.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. One is I don't see why we would need story polls for anything that's not going to planning commission. Like sometimes I'll be on a walk and I'll see story polls and get excited because I'm like, oh, we'll get to vote on this. And then I see that it's a minor development. So I think that we shouldn't have story polls for those. I don't think that there should be a requirement if it's a 100% affordable development. And I think we should even consider lessening that percentage. We have very few incentives available to us to incentivize affordable housing development. And I actually think that this could be something we could leverage to try to get developers to include more affordable units in their developments. For example, if they're wanting to build something that is like 60 or 70 feet, I would hope that a lot of those would be affordable. And maybe if there was a percentage that if they reached, they wouldn't need to have story poles, then they wouldn't have to do those cranes and stuff. And I think that that could end up being a good incentive. I don't think there should be story poles for additions to buildings, at least for the most part. I don't know how many nuances there would be in that. And then also, we might start seeing more non-discretionary developments, like things that the town doesn't even get a say over, using the different bills and stuff. So I don't know if there already wouldn't be story polls for that because of the nature of it. But if we're not going to have a say in it, I don't see why we would need to put those story polls up and make people afraid of something that probably won't look nearly as ugly as the story polls anyway. And last, I agree that there should be a different set of requirements for the hillsides. I think that's a really good idea, and that we should have more story polls around there and stuff because those developments are a little more serious, I think. And those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. It's a good contribution to the discussion. Commissioner Hanson.
I wanted to thank Commissioner Thomas for the suggested proposal. I was looking at all the different kinds of things, and where my thinking came out was in general, or is in general on this, is that I think there's certain parts of town where we do want to consider having story poles, for example, the hillsides, because, you know, when all is said and done, we have a hillside sign standards and guidelines and a hillside specific plan, and the whole idea is to, you know, make sure that we do our best to preserve the hillsides and while allowing some amount of residential development. So I think to take away story pole requirements for that would be a tough thing, not to mention the fact that even without the current land use for the 2040 general plan it's been referended, whatever gets approved is likely to go in that same direction because of fire safety, to be very careful about development that's in the hillsides. I would add to that list projects, since we have a historic preservation committee, and it's so important to preserve our historic features of town, that I would want to have story poles for those kinds of projects, whether or not it is asking for a variance. Speaking to Commissioner Clark's general suggestion about planning commission or not, if it was said a different way, I would think that any other residential, especially single-family developments, if it's not asking for a variance in height or setback or, you know, whatever that would cause it to come to planning commission, but I would call it a variance, that I would think it wouldn't be an issue, except for one thing, and that's because of all the time I've sat on the planning commission where we have a lot of single-story neighborhoods. If someone comes in and both of their neighbors on either side are a single-family home with a single story, and they're going to be, you know, 10 feet or 20 feet above them, you know, I think that's something we have to consider to as needing a story pole for that case, even if they're not asking for an exception, just because it's going to change the character of the neighborhood. And then as far as the affordable housing, I too thought that if we were lucky enough to get a 100% affordable housing project, we should let it happen. And it has to comply with our standards anyways. And so I think that we should give an exception for that and not require story poles for that.
Thank you very much. Other comments? Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. And I think, Commissioner Hanson, I think you've taken all my great ideas, which we both took from Commissioner Thomas. So my thinking is, and I think I'm repeating ourselves, and I think we're coming hopefully to somewhat of a consensus, but maybe just to simplify it, my sense is I would like to see the story pole continue in historic districts and in the hillside areas for all projects. I think, especially in the hillsides, it's very valuable to see what's happening up there. We've had a couple projects that come before us. You really don't get a sense of it looking until you look from the ground and you look up into a hillside and you see either netting or flags or whatever that may be. I think there's a value there. With respect to every other portion of town, my sense is that with respect to new construction for single-family homes and commercial, if you are not seeking a variance with respect to height or FAR or any other matter, and this goes with respect to additions, new construction, new roof lines, I don't see the value necessarily of story poles. I think those matters could be handled probably better by renderings. And as long as we have those renderings and can somehow make them available to the public via QR code or something else, I think that works. So I would use story poles in the hillside, in the historic districts for all construction. I would use them in other areas for where there's variances sought, and I'll also use them for projects where there are specific plans or they're unusually large. North 40 is the obvious example, just to give a better sense of scale. But I think that would, for the lion's share of single-family construction going on in our town, would obviate the need for story poles and handle it in a much less intrusive, more efficient manner with 3D renderings.
Thank you for those comments. Commissioner Clark.
I just have one very brief comment. I agree with Commissioner Hanson that a development in a neighborhood that's majority single story and they come to Planning Commission because they're the first, second story development in the immediate neighborhood or something like that, I think that's exactly the kind of thing where it might still make sense to have story poles to get an idea of the massing, because the whole reason it's coming to Planning Commission in that case is the massing. And that's why I was not using the language of variances. Why I was trying to say if it's coming to Planning Commission, because yeah, I do think that's an instance where we should have them.
Thank you. I do have one question for the town attorney. I think this is addressed in G already, but can you comment on the issue of story poles under the new emerging housing laws in terms of cost burden or procedural delay?
Sure. There's no case exactly on point, but there are cases talking about what constitutes a constraint on housing in other contexts. And the cases talk about height limits, they talk about parking standards and processing and permit procedures. I do think conceivably an applicant could make an argument that imposing a story pole requirement did constitute a constraint on housing, but in the cases that have been decided under the other fact patterns where it had to do with building height and parking standards, the court, weighed the public interest against the burden on the applicant. And in those cases, they came out in favor of the public interest that was at stake. And so that's a policy decision for the council, for the commission, like to what extent do the story poles serve a public policy interest. But the court would put a lot of weight on the public policy interest.
Great. Thank you very much. And before we ask for a motion, let me see if we have any further discussion. Commissioner Thomas.
I guess that my only question is that right now it does say this is non-residential additions exceeding 100 square feet. I don't think that we are going to have non-residential in hillsides. So I don't think that we really need to discuss that here. But it does say new. I mean, I guess that I suggested the 900 square feet because that's what Los Altos Hills has. And I assumed that their staff had been informed by some reason. But I am interested in hearing what other commissioners think about that number, or if that is something that we can just say, of a specific number, and, town council, you decide in our motion a little bit. And then my other question is just about I guess that's it for now. Sorry.
Thank you. Commissioner Clark again.
I'll just say that I'd be in favor of the 900. I like that number. I think it makes sense. Los Altos Hills is doing it, that we would do it on our hills.
Commissioner Hanson.
I like the 900 square feet as well. I think that made a lot of sense. And plus we have example from another jurisdiction that seems to be working for them. But I did want to also comment on the non-residential additions exceeding 100 square feet. A lot of times we see in the hillsides, they don't just build a house, they build a compound. And the compound would have multiple buildings they may not be living in them. They use them, it's part of their residential compound, but they're not going to be sleeping there. And so I think, and staff can correct me, that's what a non-residential addition exceeding 100 square feet, that in our current policy needs to be story pulled.
Thank you for the question. No, my understanding of that third bullet is that is for commercial properties.
Oh, it's commercial.
Where there are additions. One clarification that I wanted to add to the discussion is the first bullet point in terms of what it applies to now excludes single-story accessory structures. So regardless of the size of a detached structure, it is not currently required to be story pulled, even if it were 900 square feet or more. So that is one component to consider, since I know that is included in the comments from Commissioner Thomas.
And through the chair, one other idea to think about is for, even if we just go to hillsides, you potentially can do a 900 square foot addition or more through just a building permit. So if they're not tearing it down and they're not creating a demolition, then that would just be a building permit where we also would not be able to require story poles.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And Commissioner Thomas again.
Okay, then I do need some additional clarification. What is considered an accessory structure versus just a regular residential structure then?
Thank you. An accessory structure is have the primary house, and then you have detached structures. Those are accessory to the main house. In some cases, it may be an accessory dwelling unit, in which case, regardless of whether it's over 900 square feet, it would just be a building permit. We do, in the hillsides, have a trigger for buildings, detached structures, accessory structures over a certain size do need to have a higher level of review. I can look up what that threshold is right now. I believe it's 450, but I'll check on that for you.
And while she's checking that, I think just a little more information. It's a detached garage. It's an ADU. It's a pool house. So those are typical detached structures that we would see that are actually floor area. So it's not like a gazebo or something that's not enclosed, which are accessory structures, but we still wouldn't have them story pole because they're not technically square footage.
Thank you for that clarification.
May I?
Commissioner Thomas.
Okay. So I think then that I don't, I'm open to any suggestions. I do feel like we need to keep some story poles for the hillsides, but I don't want to create additional burdens than what we currently have, because I feel like the standards that we currently have are working for the hillsides. So whatever other commissioners think, however that looks, I'm happy with. And then also we didn't discuss commercial yet. So I don't know if people have different opinions about commercial and or mixed use.
Right. So B is very comprehensive, and we've been appropriately discussing it in different contexts. But I think that's a good point, Commissioner Thomas. And we can move on to that. So let's see, I see on page 14 that the current story pole policy requires non-residential additions exceeding 100 square feet. And we just talked about it in terms of residential accessory structures. Maybe I could ask staff to address what we might see that fits the description of a non-residential addition exceeding 100 square feet.
Thank you. A non-residential addition exceeding 100 square feet often will trigger an architecture and site review application. In some cases, that may just be going to the Development Review Committee if they are not asking for exceptions and they are complying with the commercial design guidelines. And so that could just be an existing grocery store wants to add a little additional space for a cafe out front or something of that nature. So the 100 square foot is the current trigger for those. There are some minor changes to commercial buildings that can be done through a building permit, but generally if it's adding square footage, and 100 is generally the threshold that we use for that, moving to a discretionary permit.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I guess we have the larger question of whether we want to exclude story poles from new commercial or mixed use. And maybe we could talk about that, Commissioner Hanson.
I actually had a question. Our current story pole policy, under what conditions do we require story poles for commercial and mixed use?
For commercial buildings, we would require it for new structures or for additions of 100 square feet or more, as stated there. In addition, to answer the earlier question about detached structures in the hillsides, the threshold for coming to Planning Commission for a detached structure is 1,000 square feet. It may require, it would require a discretionary review for the Development Review Committee if it was between 600 and 1,000 square feet. But over 1,000 is automatically reviewed by Planning Commission at this time. But would not generally be story poled if it's a single story detached structure, based on the current policy.
Okay, any other comments in terms of mixed use or commercial? Yes, Commissioner Respi.
Thank you, Chair. My thoughts on commercial and mixed use are much like my thoughts on residential. That is, I'm not sure they're a great tool where our applicant is bringing a project that's not seeking an exception to, again, either height, FAR, or other limiting requirements. So as long as the project is within our guidelines, I think for all new and redeveloped commercial mixed-use projects, story pole probably isn't the best tool. I'll put one caveat on there. We may want to consider really large projects, something bigger than, I'll put the Whole Foods project that we just considered last month. That was a larger size project. I thought the story poles kind of expressed pretty well what that project looked like. So perhaps there's a square footage we might want to consider over which we would use story poles. But for, I think, the day-to-day, to the extent there are any day-to-day mixed-use commercial projects in town, to the extent that they're not seeking exceptions, I wouldn't impose upon them a story pole requirement. And again, would just require 3D renderings.
Thank you very much. Other thoughts? Commissioner Hanson?
I agree with the Vice Chair on that general approach. And I thought of another property which we have seen before, and I don't know where it currently stands because I think it's going through things. But at the corner of Shannon Road, there's the Artisan Wine Depot, and we had seen that previously at Planning Commission, and you know, it caused a big upstir with the neighbors, and ultimately I think they're going in a different direction anyways. But that's the kind of thing where I wouldn't not want story poles for that kind of project. But if it's just some, you know, remodeling or new commercial building, it's in compliance and it's not, you know, very large structure, that would seem like overkill to do the story poles for that kind of project.
I'm giving some thought to that. To the best of my knowledge, the Shannon and Los Gatos Boulevard property originally was talking about a mixed use, commercial and residential. Is that correct?
The last thing was an office, I believe staff could correct
Or
it,
office only?
But
office above commercial of a different sort.
Or residential above commercial?
It was office.
Up.
At this time, the proposal is office over commercial. I don't believe there is any residential as part of the current proposal.
Right, okay, that was my understanding too. Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for staff. If a project comes through and there are no variances and it gets sort of the green light from our staff, however, the neighbors find out about the project and they're not happy about it, can they still appeal the project?
Thank you for that question. So if there is a project that is going through a discretionary review process, they, whether it is a minor residential development, in a new second story on a single story house that does not require a public hearing, it still involves public notice and the ability to appeal the director's decision. Projects that go to the Development Review Committee, where they are complying with all of the regulations and complying with the design guidelines, also can be appealed to the Planning Commission. As long as the appellant is someone who qualifies to appeal the project as stated in town code.
Thank you.
Other thoughts? We've covered a lot of ground. Commissioner Hanson.
I just wanted to bring up something that we didn't talk about, which was the building height. It did cross my mind that when we're talking about a 7 foot, 70, I think it was at 80 feet. Mr. Kapurbis mentioned 70 feet, I guess it was. The complexities of doing story poles for that seem to be quite onerous because of the danger factor. So I don't know if we can recommend that, like, for a certain height limit, that we can consider X alternative. I don't know, that would be better. Some things were suggested, like putting cranes or whatever. Maybe we don't do story poles at all. Maybe, I don't know what the best solution is, but I think it's important to make sure that people in the town are able to see those. But it maybe the traditional way of doing story poles might not work. So I'm just curious to what other people think.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Commissioner Thomas.
I agree, and I think that what we've heard from public comment is that one of the most important parts of the story poles is that it gives notice to people. And so I think that some of this the concern with, like, especially tall buildings or something, and some of these other even commercial projects that we're talking about right now, it's really just about letting the public know. And I think that we want to move away from the story poles letting the public know for reasons like what happened at North 40, right? Like, by the time those story poles went up and everyone was like, what's going on here? It was really too late for the community to be as heavily involved with the decision making. So I do think that when we talk about in section D, about the signage and alternatives for signage, I think that we can cover a lot of the major concerns and hopefully start to help people in town transition from story poles trigger this is a project that's happening, and now I see this sign that triggers this is a project that's happening. So that being said, I don't think that for commercial and mixed use projects, I don't think that most of the time, even if they're new builds, we need story poles. I think that I agree it's if they're asking for an exception or a variance, but I think we should kind of specify that, because I do think that there are a lot of exceptions and variances that, like, story poles aren't going to add or change anything. Maybe if it has to do with height or setbacks or something else, I guess, related to those things. But if it's an exception for, let's say, like parking minimums, which I know we're going to get a lot more of because we're going to be in the process of changing our parking, I'm sure, and that's just the trend overall, right? So as the boulevard redevelops, like, we're going to be getting a lot of requests for those things. I don't think something like a parking minimum should trigger story poles having to go up, if that makes sense. So I don't know if there's a list of specific specific items that we could include, or, just make a general recommendation to town council that it should be specific for commercial buildings, but it looks like Ms. Armour has a suggestion, so.
If that is the direction that the commission is going, it could be stated in the form of a variance or exception related to physical characteristics of the structures. And so that it is something that's being shown by those story poles. And we could work to get something specific and more detailed for town council to consider.
Good suggestion. We also haven't talked about the issue of flag ropes or pennants, and also the visibility exception. I wonder if anyone has comments on either of those topics. Is it the next? Oh, that's under alternatives. I'm sorry, I had that in my notes at this point. So let me just review what our topics were under B and make sure that we've covered those. Well, I do think, let me go ahead first. I do think that we could focus more on the discretion issue, although that also comes up later. But on page 15, there's a discussion about the reviewing body. The director, Development Review Committee, Planning Commission, Town Council. I guess this would be a suggestion that we consider this in terms of exceptions.
Correct. I would say that a discussion of who the deciding body is for any discretionary parts of this, that's something that could be part of the discussion under section E of the staff report, modifying the exception process. And some of the other topics that you have mentioned recently about the flags could fall under the modifying physical requirements under section C. Providing alternatives also could be discussed under section D. So the types of projects that this applies to, I think, is what's been discussed so far.
Right.
Though we haven't received a motion on that yet.
Right. Commissioner Hanson.
I was just going to say, relative to what you said, I think this started with Commissioner Clark making a suggestion that if Planning Commission was the deciding body, that they probably needed to be story poles. And that would include things like we talked about where it's the first two-story house in a single-family neighborhood. It could be if there's a variance, those kinds of things tend to trigger Planning Commission. So I thought we already had discussed that and had sort of a consensus, but maybe, I've just put that out there. I know we did discuss it.
Thank you. Well, I guess the subject could also be addressed in E on page 16 when we get to that. Commissioner Thomas? Or it could be made part of a motion. I have no problem with that.
Okay. Well, I did have just a question about specific plans, because I did put that into my recommendation, just about like special story pole requirements for specific plans. I have not been on Planning Commission while any of these specific plans have like been developed, but I know that, the example is the North 40 specific plan. So I don't know if staff, you could just answer a couple questions about how that's developed, if like story poles can be included in that process or not, etc.
Thank you for that question. I would say that just like with the development of the general plan, it's difficult when you don't have a specific development project in front of you to do a story pole installation. Generally, a specific plan is going to be a smaller area than the general plan, but it is generally for a large area, and so it's going to be looking at multiple buildings, and you don't know what the configuration of those buildings are, whether the floor area would be done in a multi-story building or flat across, So that is one of the difficulties about planning documents, right? Is we don't know how they will actually be implemented, and so it's difficult to do physical story poles for that in that case at that stage in the process.
So, but is it legally possible to, when that plan is being developed as part of those agreements and the plan being processed, like that story poles will be part of the process later?
I'll open it to our town attorney to see if she wants to add on that.
So, I wouldn't refer to a specific plan as an agreement per se. Like, I would consider it as like a mega zoning ordinance.
Yeah.
Like, it's setting forth like what the rules are, what the maximum can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think any requirement to impose story poles would probably live outside of this specific plan.
Okay.
You might also be thinking of like development agreements where an applicant comes in and they want a development agreement, and maybe they want to give an entity something extra in exchange for like vesting to existing standards. And so as part of that development agreement, maybe there's something extra they would give would be, providing story poles or something like that. But for the commission, I would think of imposing the story pole requirement outside of this specific plan.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking if we have like a large area, we don't have a lot of large or open space, but if we have a large area that we're planning, that there is going to be a development for, would we want in that specific space? But it's probably very niche, so not important. I did kind of want to go back to the reviewing body before making a motion, because I do not feel that every single thing that comes in front of planning commission needs to be story polled. And I think that that might significantly delay processes that we're trying to help people streamline. So I'm happy to come to an agreement and, just state that and know that town council knows that. But I don't think that every single thing that comes before us needs to be story polled. But I am curious to see what other people have to say about that, just to clarify that point. And then also just with regards to the historic districts, I think that I just wanted some clarification about, do you think all projects in historic districts, or just projects that are listed in the historic list? I forget what it's called.
Registry.
Inventory, thank you. The historic inventory within the historic districts should require story poles. Thank you.
A lot of good thinking going on here. Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, thank you. Well, to answer or to respond to that question, I think all homes in a historic district should have story poles because it affects the whole district, and usually a district is like, if we ever get the Glen Ridge, a district, it'll be 12 blocks. So I think, homes impact the whole district. But back to another question for staff. I'm a little confused here. So you were saying that a large project would not require story poles if it doesn't have variances. And of course, there probably would be variances. But if it didn't have variances and it's a large project, let's say one of the ones that are going up on Los Gatos Boulevard, and it doesn't have variances, so it wouldn't require story poles. But on the other hand, then how would citizens be able to appeal the size of it and the mass and the density of it is the permit, are they already permitted? Is the permit go through when does that happen? I mean, I'm trying to educate myself and the public probably on this subject. It's sort of important to me. What I'm trying to address is that citizens have a ability to respond to a project, and if it's not required with story polls because there's no variances, how will the public know? And I don't think videos and looking at renderings will do it because people are busy, and I don't think they'll be being aware so much.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for those questions. If you'd like, I can try and address some of that. What we were talking about, where I was saying that story polls would not be required, is when a specific plan or general plan is being considered and adopted, because at that point we don't have a specific building design being proposed. It's more about setting the rules, the zoning rules for an area. And so when a project does come through, then the question now is, when a development project comes through, at what points do story poles get installed? As I'm looking at my notes from the discussion that Planning Commission has been having this evening, the consensus items that I have heard was interest in having story poles for certain projects in the hillsides, projects in the historic district, projects where it is the first, second story in what we define as the immediate neighborhood. And for larger commercial projects, the example of Whole Foods was given as trying to give a sense of what the threshold might be for what might be considered a larger project. But for anything smaller than that, and any other single-family homes or smaller projects, that it would not require story poles unless they were requesting a variance or an exception to a physical zoning code requirement. So that's what I've heard so far. I expect there will be further discussion, but hopefully that helps you understand what I've heard, at least in terms of the size of the projects that would still require some sort of story poles. We of course haven't gotten to the section of the discussion where what that story pole requirement might be for some of the larger, more complex projects. In any case, I think there's an understanding that signage would still be required, and so there is still the opportunity to then ask questions and understand and be part of the development project.
Okay, thank you. And just a quick follow-up. So when do story poles go up? When the project comes before you, or it doesn't have a permit yet, right?
Correct.
It's okay.
So story poles, generally application comes in and it goes through review by staff, and staff is looking to make sure there's sufficient understanding of what the project is. Sometimes we don't have the details that are needed in the project scope in the plans, and so we're working to make sure we've got those details and to understand what type of permit is required, whether it triggers architectural review, for example. Once we have gotten to a point working with the applicant that the project is whole and is ready to move forward to public hearing or public noticing, that's when story poles go up. Because otherwise, as part of the staff review, there might be changes to the form of the building that would require them to modify the story poles.
Okay. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Commissioner Hanson and then Commissioner Clark.
I just wanted to comment back on what Commissioner Thomas brought up, which is about the Planning Commission. So, and I think you summarized it correctly, Ms. Arbor, in terms of what I think there was sort of consensus on. It's not everything that comes to Planning Commission, but if it's a variance that involves bulk and mass, such as the setbacks, the height, the FAR, if it's a fence issue or something like that, or they don't have enough parking spaces or something like that, those are not things that I would think of. So I just wanted to be clear that that's what I was thinking of when Commissioner Clark mentioned Planning Commission or not, but it wouldn't include variances that that didn't pertain to the bulk and mass of the structure.
Thank you. Commissioner Clark was next.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciated you bringing that back up because I meant we should never require them, at least for the most part or at all, for things that are not coming to Planning Commission. But I don't think we should require them for everything coming to Planning Commission. And I really do think we should make an effort to not require them whenever possible. I think, like Commissioner or Vice Chair Espy was saying, just when we need them, we require them, sort of thing. So yeah, I appreciate the clarifications on that. And then for me, I would say that we should only require them in terms of the historic district for homes that are in the historic resources inventory, but I am open to going the other way on that.
Commissioner Raspy?
My comment was similar. The language we're talking about so far is, and I've served on the HBC now for 3 years. So the best way to think of our historic homes, we have districts, but we have many historic homes which are not in our districts. Presumptively, all our pre-1941 homes are historically designated. So I would, in our category of homes that should require story pole for work as performed, would include all homes on our historic inventory, whether or not in a district. I'm sorry, one more point, Chair, if I may.
Please.
I think one other point we had on, at least working toward consensus, was not requiring story poles where there was a large percentage of affordable housing in the project, perhaps 100, maybe not requiring 100, but I think there's a favorable view towards that, making it a more efficient and creating incentives for those projects where possible.
Very good. Other thoughts before we try a motion? Commissioner Thomas.
So, since I have not served on the Historic Preservation Committee, I am curious how the story polls have been helpful for you all in your decision making, because I do think that, like we've discussed, in my opinion, there are alternatives to, and I don't think that these houses are on the historic inventory list. The reason, the adjustments that we're approving, I don't know. I just don't know how story poles are actually valuable for houses outside historic districts, but that are still historic,
Sure.
I guess.
I'll give you an example. We had HBC actually met today, and we had a small Mediterranean home, very close to the street, and much of the developer's credit, they are saving the facade of the home. But to make it a more livable home in 2023, they are adding an entire section to the back of the home. They're creating the second story, and they're pushing about another 35 feet, setting the structure back 21 feet from the facade of the home. It could potentially, and we've seen it in other projects, changes the entire character of the house, the sizing and massing of it. Maybe 3D rendering solves that problem, but I don't know, because in HBC we've been using oftentimes the story polling, which sends that message. So I've, in HBC, found that a useful tool in that kind of situation. Granted, if we're adding 100 square feet in the back, that's probably not what we need to see. But where it really changes the character of the home, I think story polling is a valuable tool for me. I hope that answers your question.
Other thoughts? I assume that in the context of a planned development, there are going to be modifications from the standard rules. And could we say that in planned developments, there would be story poles, or what's staff's recommendation on that?
Thank you for that question. It's hard to know exactly what the modifications from the standard rules that would be requested as part of a plan development. And I can think of a couple of examples that wouldn't meet the criteria that we're currently talking about in terms of physical variances from the rules. For example, having a smaller width to the roadway, not wanting to do a private roadway, and so having a smaller width there, or having a smaller lot size so that the homes on a hillside property could be clustered in a flatter area and leave more room open for open space. That type of project would be potentially going through a plan development process, but the structures themselves may actually be complying with the physical floor area, height, setback requirements.
So what that could be a possible format for a plan development if there were in fact changes that related to the building structures or setbacks. What would your recommendation be in terms of story poles?
I would say that it's an item worth discussing, but it is hard to know since each plan development, as is the intent of that tool, is going to be custom to the particular project and setting. And the detail that the plan development goes into in terms of the form of the structures really does vary significantly from one plan development to another. Most of the ones we've seen recently do get pretty specific about the form of the buildings. And so then at that point, the architecture and site application really is just making sure that it complies with what was already prepared, the drawings in the plan development. So it's hard in that case, I would say, to recommend one blanket rule for all plan developments. But I think they could potentially be guided in the same way as the other rules that Planning Commission is currently discussing.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Well, the chair will now entertain a motion from one brave commissioner.
I think I got it.
Commissioner, tell us.
Okay. So I moved to, what are we on? B. For B, types of development projects, move to include the following types of projects that should be required to install story poles. And that would be for residential projects, if they're the first, second story in a neighborhood, or if the project is requesting a variance or exception to physical characteristics of the structures. Only. Yeah, no, I'm just waiting because I'm writing it down. Okay, then for historic districts, all new residential and non-residential buildings in historic districts, and all residential second-story additions in historic districts, and non-residential additions exceeding 100 square feet. Okay, what we have right now, but just for historic districts. Okay. And then for the hillsides, just new buildings or second-story additions in the hillsides. And then generic commercial everywhere else besides the historic districts. Only additions over 100 square feet or new builds asking for variances or exceptions to physical characteristics of the structure. I think that includes everything.
Did you comment on affordable housing?
Oh, affordable housing. Yes. Some number of affordable housing to be determined by town council, to be discussed by town council, should be allowed an exception, or one of the categories of exceptions, or be exempt, I guess I should say.
And then Commissioner Raspy brought the concept of a large project, which...
For commercial, and I think we used, by way of example, Whole Foods. So anything of the Whole Foods or larger size would require a commercial project, mixed use, of X number of feet to be determined by town council, but by form of reference, town Whole Foods.
You think in general?
Please?
Okay.
Yeah.
So do we think in general or only if they're asking for exceptions? Because I think that if they're only asking for exceptions to the physical, like to mass and height and all of that, that's really valuable. But once again, I think that the signage is what we need to, think we need to get off the crutch of like story poles as telling people this is going to happen, and lean into the signage as this is telling people it's going to happen.
So my thought, and again, I'm flexible, is two requirements in the commercial mixed-use area. A, where there is a variance sought with respect to massing location, the physical structure. Or B, all structures over X square footage, because some are of such scale that I think the netting or flagging, whatever we call it, serves a purpose of conveying the sense of scale for it. So I use by way of example, Whole Foods. I got a sense as I was driving down Los Gatos Boulevard how big that was because of the story poles. I thought that was helpful. On your run-of-the-mill day-to-day commercial, I don't think it's that helpful. But for something big like that, and I don't know what the cutoff is, but I use Whole Foods as a way of example, I would like to try to retain a story pole requirement for the supersized buildings.
Through the chair, since we do have a motion on the table, she could accept modifications to her motion, or it could be a follow-up motion if additions was, whether we had the majority of the commission to add in this additional commercial.
Do you know offhand the size of what Whole Foods was?
It was in the
Like 6.
I think it was 40 to 50,000, somewhere in that range.
50,000. Okay. 50? Anything 50 or above? Yeah, just around 50 or above, perhaps. I'm not happy about it, but I'll accept it. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, a motion is amended to include those. Thank you.
And for consideration by the maker of the motion, we talked about possible height limits. Is that something you want to include or not?
I didn't have anything specific written down. I think that maybe can also be in the modify physical requirements section, just because that has to do, I think, with like how high we can do story poles.
Okay, very well.
Okay.
And I just raised the question, did the motion include our thoughts about not requiring story poles if it's not going to the planning commission level? It did include that. Okay, thank you. So now we'll look for a second.
Commissioner Hanson.
Oh, Commissioner Hanson, sorry.
I can make a second, but I did have a requested modification. So I will
Please.
second the motion, but I would ask the maker of the motion, the part that you brought up about the first house in a predominantly in a the very first two-story house in a single family. I also considered the scenario where you have, it might not be the first house in the way we define it in the residential design guidelines, but if there's a single story house on either side of it and it's going up to 2 stories, these are the ones that cause the most consternation with the neighbors. So I would put that case in there as well. If on both sides it's got single stories and it's going up to 2 stories, that would be one where I would think it would be important.
So just for clarification, it sounds like right now, as the motion stands, as I hear it, that requirement for story poles would only apply to a new 2-story home or a new 2nd-story addition when it is the first in the immediate neighborhood, and the immediate neighborhood includes 2 houses on either side of the proposed project, plus the properties across the street, generally 5 properties across the street. And so what Commissioner Hanson is suggesting is that even if you have a 2-story home that's in one of those, say, 2 houses away, if the 2 houses, one on either side of the proposed house, if those are both single story, and so this is kind of a taller building in between, I believe the suggestion is that would also trigger, even if there are other 2 stories in the immediate neighborhood.
Yes, that is what I meant. If there was a 2-story across the street and on either side there's single story, yes, that's when I would want the story poles.
So to the maker of the motion.
If that's the will of the commit. Okay, then yes, again, not what I originally planned, but happy to make that change, that the motion to include that.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second in discussion. Commissioner Clark?
I have 2 questions. One is, I feel like sometimes we have come to Planning Commission a home and it's not the first single or the first 2-story home in the immediate neighborhood, but maybe it's like the second immediate neighborhood and one of the few in a predominantly single-story neighborhood. Is that the case? And if so, should we consider that in our motion? Well, for the other part, for the one where if it's the first two-story in the immediate neighborhood, but sometimes it would be the second two-story in the immediate neighborhood, but would come to Planning Commission because of its bulk?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, there have been some examples. For example, if it's the largest house in the immediate neighborhood by floor area or floor area ratio, then that is sometimes something that will trigger review by the Planning Commission. Just not necessarily a recommendation for denial from staff, but a higher level of review. And so at this time, with the motion as it stands, those wouldn't necessarily be triggering story polls, but they might still be coming to Planning Commission, depending on the adjacency, whether there are two-story homes adjacent.
So we'll come back to Commissioner Thomas on that.
So I think that if they were requesting a variance or an exception to something related to height or setbacks or whatnot, then it would require story polls. So from my understanding, I think that that's a good compromise, that just because of the situation, to not become too specific. But do you want me to amend the motion?
I wanted to at least flag it because it is changing what generally triggers us to consider those things for review by the Planning Commission. And so it felt like if that's our concern, is it being the bulkiest in the neighborhood, but then we define it differently than we would normally if we might be voting on it. So I'm open. I just wanted to bring that up.
So Commissioner Burnett, and then we'll get back to the maker of the motion.
Thank you. And considering the motion, it's gotten a little involved now, so I want to be sure, would your motion cover what Commissioner Raspy talked about, a pre-1941 home that would require the story polls, even though if it was not in a historic district, but that would be... Thank you.
I don't know if that was explicitly mentioned, but yes, that was my intent, that historic homes.
So it could be stated as homes that are part of the historic inventory. That does include all homes within the historic districts as well.
Okay, so homes within the historic inventory that are, the new builds or new residential and non-residential buildings or residential second-story additions.
Okay, Commissioner Clark, if you would.
Yeah, I have a question for staff. Do you know roughly how much of our town is historic districts?
Unfortunately, I don't have that number off the top of my head.
No worries. I think my concern is, I think for me, I would probably be opposed to requiring story polls in all historic districts. And for me, it would also depend how much of town it is, but that could end up being a lot of town, I might think.
So the clarification that I can provide is that the historic districts really are downtown at this time. There's the potential that others could be added in the future. The part that would extend beyond kind of the downtown area is these houses that were built before 1941, that when it is listed as a pre-1941 build date, then we presume it to be historic until it has gone to the Historic Preservation Committee and requested and received permission to remove it from that, in which case it would no longer trigger these requirements. But at this time, anything that is triggering that review by the HPC would be falling under this requirement as well, as currently stated.
Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, I would say, I would hope we would retain that and not change the motion on that subject. I think it's very important to keep our pre-1941 homes intact as much as possible, and I think story polls help actually the designer, the builder, a homeowner to help design to keep the home as it started out, like the home we had today. I mean, it was a very good project, and it was very helpful. So I think it's a very important, I would encourage the maker of the motion to retain that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comment. I have one question. Did we talk about a project where there's no visibility from the public right-of-way? To exclude the requirement of story poles under those circumstances?
I did not, but I assumed that most of those projects were a lot of times in the hillsides, but then we can see them from view corridors. So I couldn't think of any. I mean, I do think that if they can't be viewed from a view corridor and they can not be viewed from a public right of way in any way, shape, or form, then I think that should be included in the excluded or exempt category. So I would amend my motion to include that because it seems unnecessary.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there a second?
Well, okay, so I guess I have an issue to bring up then. We saw at the Conceptual Development Advisory Committee, the first meeting this year, a potential for a very large, a concept for a very large development in Surrey Farms, and that would be 22, 23 homes, including ADUs. I would think that we would, and you can't see that from the viewing platforms, but everyone in that neighborhood will be able to see it. Yeah. Right, so I wouldn't want them not to have to do story polls. So I was hesitating about taking that out if you can't see it from public viewing platforms, because there are quite a few developments where you wouldn't want that to happen, without the neighbors being able to see it.
Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I know exactly where that lot is, and it is viewable, not from our specific view corridors, but it is viewable from all of like Long Meadow and everything. So I understand. So my intent was that this was like truly a project that couldn't be viewed from any street. But I don't even know if that can be written in, like if that is legally too complicated to write in. So yes, probably. So maybe I should just, okay, thank you.
Comment from
It sounds like you answered your own question, but it's not too complicated to write it in if the commission wants to exclude properties that aren't viewable from view corridors or public right of way. But it sounds like there's a debate happening.
So if any public right of way would include Long Meadow, so this would not be included as exempt.
One question of clarification: what about private roadways? We have a number of private roadways which are done by easement rather than public right of way, and so especially in the hillsides. So just to fully understand and discuss kind of the implications of that, it can be written in there, but you may have cases where something is visible from a private street to the people who drive up and down that private street, but it would not qualify for this requirement of story poles because of the way you're currently phrasing it.
So the way that I'm currently phrasing it, I think that for me that would be okay, because that seems like a huge burden to put financially on a builder or developer for one or possibly a couple of private property owners to be able to see the story poles, versus like we do know that there are alternatives of the renderings, et cetera, et cetera. So I am comfortable with that, but thank you for bringing that up.
Other comments on the motion? Commissioner Espy?
Just on this last issue, and hopefully it's the last issue. My only concern is, it seems to me that the types of homes we're talking about here are the ones most likely to be in hillsides. Yeah. And those I think are among the categories when we first started this discussion that would be most benefited by story poles. Because I think, look, viewing corridors change over time. My sense is that by introducing an element of not visible from viewing corridors, we're introducing maybe an element that's creating too much ambiguity, I thought.
Okay. I agree, but I also included public right of ways. So I feel like there would be very few lots or properties that would qualify with all of that, but I don't know because I don't know that much about like the extent of the mountainsides and everything. So I'm happy to get rid of it if we feel like it's too complicated, or just, now town council knows we mentioned this. If they want to deal with it, that's fine with me. So yes. And I also do just want to state that I am on the same page with Commissioner Clark. I don't feel like we need story poles for everything in all of the historic districts. I'm happy to keep it for the historic inventory list. And I understand that would cover a lot of the historic districts anyway. All of it. It would cover all of the historic district. So I guess that, then I guess it doesn't really matter if you guys feel strongly about it. Okay. Anyway.
Okay. So we have a motion, we have a second. Any further discussion? If not, I'll ask the commissioners to raise their hand in approval. And we have a unanimous vote on that. Thank you.
One question, and I'm sorry, so did the motion delete the requirement or the proposal that properties be exempt if they're not visible from right-of-way or
That was removed, yeah.
Okay.
No.
It's included.
Oh, I included it.
It's included.
Because that seconder didn't ask, but yeah. But the town council knows that we weren't sure, so there you go.
It was included, yes.
Okay, and so did everybody who voted knew that? Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Let's see, our time is 9:30. We could take a break now if commissioners are desirous of doing that. Otherwise, we can plow ahead. I don't see any requests.
I think the remaining topics are quick, hopefully.
Okay.
So, is that push through? No spoilers.
So we've got C and D left, and we'll move on to C at the bottom of page 15. And this addresses the concept of what kind of netting or alternatives we should consider. Current policy requires all building corners and heights to be demonstrated by the flagging system. And that would include towers, spires, elevators, mechanical penthouses, cupolas, mechanical equipment, screening, and similar elements not used for human activity or storage, which are visible from the streetscape. So I'll open the discussion on that item and see if there are any comments. Commissioner Clark.
I have two changes I'd like to see. I don't think we should require internal story poles. I think that adds a huge cost burden. And something that I want to note, like looking at the North 40, those units are expensive. And we know that it took almost $1 million to put in all those story poles. And that cost gets passed down to the homeowner or tenant. It's not absorbed by the developer. So I think it's important to look at where we can lower the cost. I think that's a good way. And then I also think we should make modifications for things like only front facade and tallest ridge rather than every architectural detail.
Okay, thank you for those comments. And other comments? Commissioner Thomas.
I support Commissioner Clark's comments. I am in agreement with that. And I also must say that I understand comments about the orange netting, but I also don't know if there's I'm happy with flags or something else that could be used, that's easy to get access to, that's inexpensive. I don't know, but when I was thinking and looking at the other jurisdictions, it's not like there's another alternative besides the orange that orange netting that does a much better job of representing what the final product is going to look like, which I feel like was a huge, like a big comment from the architects that we got. So I don't know if there's a way that we can really adjust that, because I don't think there's really a product out there that's less expensive and less wasteful that's more available, according to my very little research. But I do agree that like the outside of the building and the height, that is the most important part. And I do think that if we're talking about from the perspective of this also is a signal to the community, this project is happening. It doesn't matter if there's 4 poles or 10 poles, like the 4 poles are going to do it for people. So that's my opinion.
Commissioner Raspy, Vice Chair.
Thanks. I'm generally in accordance with both commissioners' prior comments. I think a representation of the general outline of the structure without going into its internal spaces, representing its high points specifically. I think there was a comment about it only representing the front facade. I think we need more than the front facade. I think we need a general footprint of the space. And I also, with respect to the orange netting, I think I find it generally non-problematic. I understand orange is a shocking color, but I think at some point we want the public to see it, and I think it's better than the alternatives. My only caveat would be, and I think reading in some of the reports, if we are in high wind areas or extraordinarily high areas, I think the netting becomes more of a problem. So maybe in those situations, maybe we'll go to flags instead of netting. But aside from that, a system that just gives us the outline with peaks using the orange netting, I think is a reasonable solution.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Hanson.
When I was looking at this, I thought of a couple things. Maybe I'm not seeing the whole picture, but if the story pole policy, it's all outside building corners and along the roof lines, and presuming the roof lines are going to be higher than the outside corners unless it has a flat roof, right? So I'm not sure why that's so onerous. And then as far as the architectural elements, when I first went through leadership Los Gatos, I remember we had a section on land use, and one of the things that came up from the community development or the assistant town manager or town manager at the time was something along the lines of the dome building. And you guys know what I'm talking about, where it is. And I don't know if that had story poles representing the dome part that is not used for anything, but it basically is, covering up a big part of the hillsides as you're driving down Los Gatos Boulevard. I wouldn't want that not to be story pole. So when I was reading this, I thought of that. And so I don't want it to be too onerous, but if we're taking it away from enough different properties, I don't see that it's too much to ask to show us the things that are really going to stick out. So maybe there's a better way to say it than to take away all these things. Maybe I don't know. I don't have a better way to say it than that, but I wouldn't want to take that away from the story pole requirement so that people wouldn't really see what's going to be built.
Okay, thank you. We might consider that as part of a discretionary decision by the town. Just throwing that as an idea, maybe something we can look at later. Other comments, Commissioner Clark?
I just have a quick question. Is the netting significantly more expensive than flags?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I think there was a comment to that effect, but I'm not sure what the difference in the cost is between the two materials.
And through the chair, I'd just add, I think some of the other comments were that you can span a greater distance with the flags than you can with the orange netting without any issues. So that's less poles you technically have to put up, which probably makes it cheaper overall.
Cool. So I personally would be in favor of looking into flags instead of netting.
Other thoughts? On C, Commissioner Thomas.
I agree that I think that all that the poles and something strung across is going to be relatively. I mean, yeah, I think that that signals that a project is happening, and so I agree that with the having an option besides the netting, including, I mean, flags, I guess, was the other suggestion, but I do think that. Or I guess rope was also included as an example. I think that that would need to be a pretty bright color. I don't know how rope would be better than flags, but I do think that maybe that could be included in the modify exception process, and we could maybe try and streamline that area. So I am happy to leave this here and then have the discuss it more in the modify exception process section in E. But I did want to ask the town attorney if that is where we should, in this section, I guess that we're not actually requiring any policy, but would it be necessary to like mention that alternatives are up to the discretion of the community development director or et cetera? Would that be necessary to be included right after the comments about what is allowed, or is it just in a completely different section of the policy?
I don't know what section would be best in, but I do think it would be a good idea to have, to specify the criteria under which an exception would be allowed so that it gets applied even-handedly. And so you could recommend to the town council that the ultimate policy allow exceptions to the netting under the following circumstances.
And that could be part of your discussion of section C of your staff report or section D. Either of those. We will take the recommendations from Planning Commission and work them into a revised story pole policy as appropriate.
All right, Commissioner Hanson, yes.
I just wanted to ask the question, pursuant to what was brought up earlier in section B about the building height, the 70-foot height building. So I'm looking at the exception process, and it says the current exception process for alternatives, including the orange snow fencing or placement of poles. And I would think the height thing would require an exception from town council. I'm trying to think of ways to get around that and to put it more in the community development director. So I don't know where this height thing would fall, but I mean, I think as long as there's a way to represent the building physically that's similar to the story poles, that it would be fine to leave that to discretion of the community development director.
Thank you for that that question. I would say that you could place that as an exception, or you could just build it in to say this is the material that is, the netting is required for all buildings unless they exceed a height of 35 feet, in which case an alternative materials of this flag rope. I don't think it was just rope. I think it's flag rope. It's the rope that has the flags on it. That is the alternative material that could be allowed when a building exceeds 35 feet, for example.
I think that
45 feet.
That sounds reasonable to me. I mean, I don't know how.
So then it's not an exception process. It's just built in.
Right. Because I do want to honor what the town council asked us to do, is to not have them, they have other things to focus on. Not that.
Other questions or comments? Commissioner Clark.
Yes. Oh my gosh, what was my question? Okay, I don't remember my question right now, but I'll think of it in like 1 second.
I believe one of the examples we saw talked about netting that designated the plate heights in different colors, and that seemed interesting to me. We talked about possible markers on the poles themselves to designate distances, perhaps at 10-foot intervals or something like that. But I think actually somehow demonstrating where the plate lines is would be helpful to envision the future building. Just a thought to throw out. Commissioner Hanson.
Oh, and I would also note that Mr. Fago also mentioned about the flags at the top. You know, with they're putting, you have the netting, but then at the very highest point, there was flags at the top, if I got that correctly, that would be worth considering.
Thank you for remembering that. And Commissioner Clark?
And I remembered my question. I wanted to ask, one of the architects during public comment talked about like only 30 being required, but we use 44 for like the level of orange or something. Do you know what that means?
Thank you for that question. They were talking about the brightness of colors that on the building that are allowed in the hillsides. And so when we're talking about a new hillside home, it's limited. It can't be a bright color. And then they were saying that the flags or the netting is very bright and therefore does not comply with the hillside development standards and guidelines for new homes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Other comments or possible motion?
I can do both again.
Thank you.
My comment is actually related to the flag at the top. I guess that's not as difficult, but just the adding more requirements to the story poles, I feel like is only going to like increase this like reliance on story poles. And I feel like at the end of the day, the goal needs to be to get people to engage, like get information to people to authentically engage in a better, more meaningful and constructive way. And I don't know if adding more information to story poles is going to do that, because I think that we need to encourage and require outreach and information sharing in a different platform. So I agree that it would be really helpful for me as a planning commissioner to be able to see the plate heights and everything like in real life. I would really appreciate that and have the poles be marked. But I feel like it would create further reliance on this process that is clearly a burden to part of our like community. And so that's just my only fear and hesitation for adding specific requirements. So that being said, I am happy to make a motion if you want me to anyway.
Please do.
Okay. So for C, modify physical requirements. Should the current requirements be modified? We say yes. The current story poles should... The modification should be that above 35 feet, alternatives to netting can be required, or can be allowed or are approved, such as flag rope. And I think that's pretty much it.
Commissioner Clark?
And then also we had discussed something more toward just displaying the general footprint of the building versus every architectural detail. So like something in that direction. And also no internal story poles.
Through the chair, may I ask for clarification on that?
Please.
We don't currently require story poles unless in the middle of the building, unless it's supporting a tall ridge. So was that intended to address situations where there are multiple buildings?
Yes. Yeah. So like for North 40, all the ones that weren't even visible unless you got a private invitation.
And through the chair, that's actually in D. So we can handle that one.
Okay.
If we get to D, then we can handle that there.
Okay.
And I think the commission's been having a lot of good discussion, but once we get a motion on the table, we really should get a second, and then we can start talking about potential amendments. It might be a little cleaner that way for us to unravel when we watch the video.
Okay, so we have a motion. We don't have a second.
I'll second the motion.
Commissioner Hanson, thank you. And discussion on the motion? If not, I'll ask for a raise of hands of those in support. And it's unanimous.
And through the chair, I just want to clarify, the motion was the flags would be allowed over 35 feet. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we've made our way to item D on page 16. This just addresses alternatives to the story pole policy, including more clarity and predictability, and potentially reducing the exception requests, which have been, as I understand, a burden to both the applicant and perhaps to the town, and to consider these options for perhaps eliminating or limiting the story pole requirements, and that is to use flag ropes, renderings and digital simulations, I can say that, signage, and reduced number of poles for multi-building projects. Let's see if, I think the rest of it has been reviewed and understood, so I'll open the discussion on item D. Commissioner Clark.
I have a couple of things. One thing I think that we should discuss is some people had a problem with having to rent story poles for a really long time. So maybe we should consider, and I don't know if this is where we would do it, or if we'd want to do it in another spot, but adding like a time limit or something so that they're not having to rent story poles for months on end and just the cost like keep accumulating. Also, I wanted to just bring up the option of, like, in order to officially notify the neighbors if we're not doing story polls, something the town could do is like send a mailer to the 10 immediate neighbors or something. And I just wanted to throw that idea out there. But yeah, those were just my first couple of thoughts.
Thank you, Vice Chair Raspy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, on Commissioner Clark's point with respect to notifying neighbors, I'd like to see perhaps a system whereby the proposed development has a sign in the front, could have a rendering on that sign, and maybe even, I think Commissioner Thomas indicated in her notes before, a QR code, which would immediately could provide the viewer access to 3D renderings to the extent those were created. And then, again, with respect to items in here in D, it also has reducing number of poles for multi-building projects. I think this is where we would include our opinion that in multi-building projects such as North 40, there wouldn't be a requirement to include internal poles. Rather, we would look for orange poles, story poles around the perimeter of the project. Those are my thoughts.
And one question I had in that concept is, what if there are higher buildings on the interior than at the four corners? Maybe something worth considering. Other thoughts? Commissioner Hanson.
I have a question for staff. We require signage and renderings under what circumstances? Because we did hear from the architects that they are always doing at least the renderings anyways. And what do we require now?
So as
Story poles or not?
Correct.
Yeah.
So in the story pole policy, it does actually include specifics about what needs to be on the signage. And it does require an elevation, the front elevation of the proposed building. When we get into something that's more complex than just a single family home, then a rendering is required.
Okay. Well, my thought was that it's pretty easy, since they're already doing that, it's easy to do it. And since we're taking away story poles from a lot of developments, that we should continue to, even if they don't have to put out story poles, that they should do renderings and digital simulations and signage. And then if they are doing story poles, they should do it as well. But the people that aren't having to do story poles should also do it. I don't know how you do that when it's not in the story pole policy, but you see where I'm going with this?
The story pole policy does include signage requirements, and so it could require that for those projects that don't trigger story poles, that signage would still be required. I think it's possible for us to work that in terms of this larger, story poles, netting, and signage policy, if that is the desire of the Planning Commission.
It was just my suggestion because I think that would be an easy way to create visibility, and it would help take us in the path of weaning people off of the need for story poles, if that was the only thing they had to look at, and we'd get some experience with it as well.
Other thoughts? Commissioner Thomas?
Yes, I agree. And I had the exact same question that if, like, we're discussing, it's currently called our height pole and netting policy, but really I feel like it needs to be renamed to, like, the story pole and netting and signage or whatever. But I think that signage is a really important part of this moving forward, and hopefully can just be more useful with the access to technology that we have. And so I did have just a question. I know that this wasn't necessarily in the topics of discussion, but it came up multiple times in all the policies that we looked at, and it's with regards to timing. And I think that that's kind of where we've been coming with a lot of the story pole stuff and everything. And I think that because we can post signage and link information, but the linked digital information can be updated, is it possible for us to require signage to be posted earlier in the process than right now, which is they go up with story poles? So that's my first question. And my second question is just related to our timing with the public notices. It just says in our current policy that it should be the height poles and netting have been installed, or where was it? It was something about, like, it just has to be before the public comment period or something. Signage, I don't remember what it said. Either way, other ones, like, it has other jurisdictions have specifics, like a 7-day or a 10-day or a 14-day. So is there a recommendation that we should put something more specific than just about, like, sometime before?
So at this time, the signage meets the same rules as our 10-day noticing for these projects. And so we require that the story poles be up, certified and photographed, and the signage be installed prior to the beginning of the 10-day notice. When we send notice cards, in general, notice cards are sent to any property within 300 feet, unless we're talking about a minor residential development application where it's a smaller radius, or the hillsides, in which case it's actually 500-foot radius. And those notice cards do include the web link to find more information about the project online so that they can see any drawings, renderings, or project descriptions available.
Okay, thank you. So with that being said, I think that we should mention the 10 days in here unless that causes confusion, because the notice period could change and then we'd also have to amend this policy. And other than that, I do think that right now the requirements on the sign are like the address and the phone number of the planning department. Not that, people shouldn't physically come down. That's great if people want to physically come down and look at things in person. But I also think information about who to email is probably also helpful. And then also just like making sure that there are requirements about website links and QR codes and things like that, because I do think that that is the most helpful way to gain access to digital information right away. I still do think that putting the signs up earlier would be helpful for everyone involved, even if the renderings end up changing. And I would be in favor of also making these signs more of a template format in some way, shape, or form that really does give visual notice to the community. A lot of the signage is developed by architects or people that work with architects, and they're really beautiful and nice to look at. And not that that's problematic, but it doesn't give the same. If we're trying to get signage to replace the indicator of a story pole, like, maybe it does need to be outlined in orange, or the title all needs to be in the same exact font in the same exact size, and then there's the area where they add the additional information. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but I do think something that's more visually striking would be really helpful during this like transition period away from the story poles.
Thank you for those comments. Other thoughts? Vice Chair Respy.
Thanks. First of all, I join in all the comments from Commissioner Thomas, and I have one question for staff. How long do the story poles have to remain up? We've heard horror stories about how they were up for 6 months and it cost $1 million. Is there a requirement, X days?
Thank you for the question. The requirement is based on completion of the public hearing process.
Okay.
And so they must be installed prior to the public notice going out. So that's 10 days in advance of the first public hearing. And then it must remain up until the end of any appeal period. And so the examples that were given were ones where there were multiple planning commission meetings, continuances, and then an appeal to town council, continuances there. And so that is how it ended up becoming that length of a period.
So maybe one of the things we might want to consider is putting a cap on that so that that burden doesn't become too onerous for our developers. I don't know if it's 30 days, 60 days, but it seems to me 6 months of carrying costs can be extraordinary. So if we want to consider that as well.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Commissioner Clark.
Thank you. I like the idea of adding a cap. I think that it, in a perfect world, it would be up until it's gone all the way through. But if the goal is to get the public's attention after 30 days, they should know that it's there. And maybe we do a really good job updating the signage to make it clear, the story poles are down, but this project is still being considered or something. But I do think that I would say 30-day cap, because I don't know what 60 would get you compared to that.
Is it correct that the staff materials online include photographs of the story poles?
We do require that photographs of the story poles be provided, and if we were considering a shorter period of time for the story poles, I think that would become standard practice, that we would provide the photos online. One element to consider is if a project then gets appealed to another deciding body, and the story poles are no longer up, then they would be relying on the photos and any renderings that were provided.
Thank you. And I had go ahead, Commissioner Hanson.
I had a question. In general, I am okay with the idea of exempting parts of the buildings that are not visible from the public right away, but just taking the example of the North 40, if you go by the outside of it, most everything is at a 35-foot height limit. However, the market hall with the 2 layers of affordable housing is at least 10 feet, if not 15 feet more. I know it's 45. Is it more than 45?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I think that was one of the things they got for the density bonus is more height there. I just would want to make sure, because we will see other projects like this with the new housing element, that they would still have to story pole at least the highest thing in there, in addition to the, even if they don't have to story pole every building. Does that make sense? Yes. So I would put that out there that way, and hopefully that's clear. Other than that, I don't think they have to story pole every building.
Okay, thank you. I'll interject a comment. The current policy, which is on page 75, includes as alternatives digital imagery, simulation, and computer modeling. And I was struck by the detail in the Santa Barbara requirements that went into this in considerable detail, particularly on pages 41 and 42, relating to photo simulations and perspective drawings and three-dimensional modeling and aerial views. And my thought would be to commend those to the town council for possible consideration as specific requirements if we go away from story poles. So if we don't have other comments, I guess we're looking for a motion at this time. Commissioner Clark.
Okay, I can try. So I move to under this is D, correct? So under D, providing alternatives, to have a reduced number of poles for multi-building projects so that only the outer buildings need to be poled, as well as the tallest building, if not one of the outside ones. That there be a QR code and email address included on the signage, that there be a time limit with a cap of 30 days for story poles to be up, for projects that don't trigger story poles for signage to be required, to consider having signage up earlier than the story poles, and to maybe standardize signage to ensure it's visually striking or catches attention.
Thank you. That's your motion, and I'll look for a second. Commissioner Thomas?
I second that. And then I did just want to clarify for the 30 days. Should it be 30 days after the initial public hearing, like after the notice, or 30 days total?
I like 30 days after the initial public hearing, I think is a good idea.
Yeah, so that's like typically would be like 40 days, the minimum, right? About, okay. Perfect.
Okay. Any thoughts about other inclusions into the possible motion? Or a second, I guess we need? Oh, you did? Okay, so we're in discussion. Are there any other thoughts about inclusion in the motion or discussion about it? Commissioner Hensley.
I meant to ask this earlier. It was in the comments of the staff report. Do we need to consider adding or mentioning anything? Towards the end, it says relocation of poles when located close to property lines to reduce guy wire conflicts and attachment of guy wires to existing trees, fences, and equipment. We didn't discuss that in the motion. What does the policy say right now on that point?
Our policy does not currently have any exception for those situations, except going through the standard exception process to town council.
And through the chair, one option might be to kind of have D have two separate motions, because these really are pretty separate topics. I think moving forward with what you have, and then see what kind of comments we have on the second portion.
Fair enough. But I just, since it was under D, I wanted to make sure that we didn't skip it. That's all. Okay.
Okay, so we have the motion. We have the second. We've had discussion. Is there anything further? If not, I'll call for a raise of hands for those who are in favor of the motion. And again, it's unanimous. Thank you very much. Commissioner Hanson, do you want to formulate a motion on your thoughts?
Well, let me ask a question first. So isn't it reasonable to and still give the idea of the story poles if we gave a more automatic exception for people that need to relocate poles that are close to property lines? I mean, is that going to not show the far, I mean, like what would be the consequence of letting them relocate the poles, and how much does that happen? I mean, I just want to understand kind of how that works.
Since this isn't an exception that we've seen frequently, it's a case where I think they've just found a way to make it work. But it could be phrased as an exception that could be considered either automatically, that within a certain distance of a property line that the poles could be set in. We could include some language that there needs to be some note about that on the signage to specify that it's not representing the full width of the building. This is me just kind of brainstorming some ideas as to how you would address that. Alternatively, you could consider this as another exception process, though as the town attorney had suggested, we would want to have some specific guidelines to guide staff through that type of exception process, when to grant it.
Well, given what you just said, I would just say that it's not a big issue, so that I would leave it at the discretion of the community development director whether that was okay or not. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a big problem, and I wouldn't want them to have to go to town council for that. And also the attachment of guy wires to existing trees, fences, and equipment. I do maybe have an issue about trees because we have so many protected trees, but the fences and equipment, I mean, as long as it's not going to damage them, I again wouldn't want to send people with an unnecessary exception, because we want them to get the story poles up. So, if they can't do it another way, then they should have that kind of alternative. So that would be a motion I would make to say that we can allow the relocation of poles located close to property lines to reduce skywire conflicts without getting an exception. And the same with attaching to other devices other than the poles they're putting up, but not trees. So that's my motion.
Thank you for the motion. Do we have a second? Commissioner Clark?
I second.
And discussion? Seeing none, call for a raise of hands in favor. Also unanimous. Thank you. So now we're going to move on to E, modify exception process. This relates to who's going to be the decision maker on certain exception requests. And I believe you've had a good opportunity to look at that and consider it. So why don't we open up for discussion? Commissioner Respy.
Thanks, Chair. My sense is the Community Development Director already handles quite a few issues with respect to the polls. And it's only certain issues that are not handled by the CDC that go up to town council. I don't see a good reason to break it down that way. To me, I think the CDC should handle all issues with respect to the story polls, take it all out of the hands of town council, who have many more and more important things to do. So my recommendation would make the CDC the decision maker for all matters with respect to the story polls and signage, as we're talking about tonight.
Okay, that's a clear motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Hanson.
I second.
And discussion? Seeing none, call for the question and raise your hands. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. I thought you were raising your hand in anticipation. Please proceed.
I just wanted to quickly say I think that's a good motion and that, we can support that if the town council would like to make that decision to offload it, we would support them doing that. But ultimately, I think this one, mostly it's going to be what the town council wants to do because it falls under them a lot of the time now, or always.
Thank you. Commissioner Thomas?
I agree. And I guess that do we need to be discussing what is part of the exemption process or just the process itself for staff right now? Just the process?
Yeah, just the process. And this is really just specifically the deciding body for exceptions.
Okay.
Because you guys the reality is with the motions that have made thus far, we're going to have far fewer exception requests, probably even for larger buildings because you provided some options. Ultimately, we'll have to wait and see what council says, but I think that's where we'll find out whether or not we need to build in additional comments related to the exception request. But this is specific to the decision maker for any exception request.
The process. Okay, good. Okay, perfect. Then that's it.
Yeah, I noticed in the staff report it refers to only 2 jurisdictions in the county that have an exception process where the authority is placed within the community development director, but I support the motion. So, any further discussion? If not, raise your hands, and it's unanimous. And we move next to F, story pole plan requirements. And we've heard about that issue from some of the commentators, and I guess we can move right on to discussion of that. Commissioner Raspy and Vice Chair.
Again, my sense is, so the story pole plan requirement is the applicant has to provide a plan to town for its prior approval before raising the poles and putting up the netting. To me, that makes eminent sense. The alternative is no plan, the poles go up, and God forbid they're incorrect, it has to be redone to a greater expense. So yes, there's a greater upfront expense in preparing a plan, but it seems to me as the most efficient, probably cost-effective measure, and so I would recommend keeping that system in place.
Commissioner Hanson.
I totally understand what the vice chair just said. However, the story poles have to be certified by an independent certification, and if I understand the role of that or those certifying bodies, is that they're supposed to take the plans and say, yes, I agree, and because I'm qualified to say so, that those story poles represent the plans, the development plans that as submitted. So while I understand having a plan would help, is that onerous on top of them having to get them certified anyways? So that's just a question I would have, and I had written down before I came to the meeting.
Is that a question to staff?
It's a question to the other commissioners.
I see. Thank you. Commissioner Clark.
I think what I heard from the architects and developers is that it's very onerous to put together that story pole plan. It sounded like it's legitimately a problem for them. And if Los Gatos is the only agency in the county that requires the story pole plan, I mean, it must work not to have one, though, would be my opinion, because everyone else seems to be getting by okay. I think one thing we could do is provide the option to get a story pole plan approved before putting them up, so that if somebody's concerned that their story poles would end up needing to be changed once they were up, they could put them forward. But if they don't, they understand that they might be assuming an additional cost if they do need to be changed.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Hanson again.
I think that's a fantastic suggestion. It's the story pole version of the Conceptual Development Advisory Committee. It's an option, if they want the confidence that they're doing the right thing, and then they can choose to do it. And they could also be a warning if you don't do it, it might be additional expense for you. I like that approach. So.
Very well. It sounds like there's a growing consensus. So is there further discussion? If not, I'll call the question. Commissioner Clark.
I wasn't sure. Do you need a motion? Okay, yeah. I will.
Thank you.
I move to make a story pole plan optional rather than required.
Thank you. Now we have a second. Commissioner Thomas.
I second the motion.
Any further discussion? If not, raise your hands in support or, okay. Another unanimous vote. So now we are down to E. No. F, story pole requirements on page 17. Oh, we just did that one, right? Right. So G is the one that's remaining, and we've heard from the town attorney on this issue tonight, but does anyone have any further questions or comments about it? I'm not seeing any. So we'll move back to our Commissioner Henson.
I will just mention that this was discussed at the last Housing Element Advisory Board meeting, and although we didn't come to any recommendation on that particular point, it was discussed at least briefly because it was brought up by HCD, but I think we all took comfort in the fact that that our town attorney's opinion, is that a court wouldn't consider that to be an issue. And especially since we're loosening a lot of the requirements for story pole policy, it seems to me that shouldn't be an impediment, especially with what we've done with 100, mainly affordable housing.
And I assume in our iterative process with HCD that this hasn't been mentioned as a requirement or a concern?
I don't believe it has specifically been mentioned, but we did provide a lot of additional information in this second round, which may lead to some comments.
Okay, thank you. So why don't we move on now to other business, and we'll begin with the report from the Director of Community Development.
Thank you. If there is nothing further on that item, we don't have anything to report out since our last meeting.
Okay, thank you. And our next meeting will be on June 14th?
That is correct.
Okay. And so we'll get to subcommittee reports. In addition to service on the Planning Commission, members of the commission serve on several town committees. And we'll begin with the Conceptual Development Advisory Committee. And I think I can answer that Ms. Hanson provided the report regarding our April 12th meeting at our last meeting on April 26th. And so we'll ask about GPAC and HBC. Commissioner Hanson.
There is currently both the General Plan Committee and also the Housing Element Advisory Board. All of the members of the General Plan Committee are also sitting on the Housing Element Advisory Board. That being said, the Housing Element Advisory Board hasn't met since March, but the General Plan Committee did meet 2 weeks ago, the day that we would have had our last Planning Commission meeting. The topic for that meeting was to consider a general plan amendment for a property on Los Gatos Boulevard, which had been approved in conjunction with the 2040 plan to make the zoning change that they wanted. And because it's been referended, the land use section, we had to recommend approval for that, which happened. We also elected a new chair, and it's Ryan Rosenberg, and our new vice chair is Commissioner Thomas.
Congratulations.
And that's it.
Thank you for that report. HBC?
Yes, there was a meeting today at 4, and we had one item, and it was homeowner and the architect came before us to get seeking our advice on a second-story addition and recommendations from the committee to maintain the feel and the look of the historic home. And I think they were very happy, and we were very happy.
Okay, good to hear. And so if
We did, excuse me, yes, and we had a second project. It was demolition of an older ADU that was in very bad repair, and we passed that and recommended it should be taken out, and then they would come back before us. Well, the recommendation was to, when they would build a new one, that it would be in similar to the historic home the property that it was on, which they were very agreeable.
Okay, thank you for that report. Any further commission matters? I'm not aware of any. We've done a lot of work tonight. And so thank you for the commissioners for your preparation and attendance, and also to staff for your hard work. And I'll call the meeting adjourned.